Hello, my friends, and welcome. I'm so glad you decided to join me tonight. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, find your most comfortable chair, and leave the busyness of the world behind. While you're getting settled, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Your engagement truly helps, and the more you interact, the more these chilling tales will find their way back to your feed. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows to share a few stories that are as true as they are unsettling. So, take a deep breath, get cozy, and let's explore the dark together.
My name is Emma Hartley. I am a true crime podcaster, and I am being hunted by someone I tried to catch. Someone who found me first. I need to write this down while I still can, before they come for me. Before the police finally understand what I have been trying to tell them for the past 6 months. My name is Emma Hartley, and I am a true crime podcaster based in Seattle, Washington. I have been recording episodes of my show Cold Case Chronicles for 3 years now, investigating unsolved murders throughout the Pacific Northwest, giving voices to victims whose stories have been forgotten, whose cases have gone cold. At least that is what I thought I was doing. But I was wrong. Because someone has been listening to my podcast, someone who knows things they should not know, someone who was there when the murders happened, someone who is coming for me now. This began in August of 2024, when I started researching a case for my podcast. It was the disappearance of Lauren Mitchell, a 26-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon, who vanished in March of 2021. She had been walking home from a bar at approximately 11:30 p.m., took a shortcut through Laurelhurst Park, and was never seen again. No body was ever found. No witnesses came forward. No evidence was discovered. The case went cold within 6 months, and Lauren's family was left with no answers, no closure, no justice. I contacted Lauren's sister, Ashley Mitchell, and asked if she would be willing to speak about the case on my podcast. She agreed, desperately hoping that renewed attention might generate new leads, might encourage someone who knew something to come forward. We recorded the interview in September. I released the episode in October, and within 24 hours of the episode going live, I received a message. It came through the podcast's email account from an address I did not recognize, a random string of numbers and letters at a disposable email service. The subject line read, "You got some details wrong." The message itself was brief, matter of fact, chilling. Lauren was not walking through Laurelhurst Park. She was running. She was being chased. And when she fell, when she realized she could not outrun him, she begged. But it did not matter. It never matters. According to research on anonymous communications in criminal investigations, approximately 60% of tips received by law enforcement come from anonymous sources. Many of these tips are valuable, providing investigators with information they would not have obtained otherwise. But some anonymous communications come from perpetrators themselves, individuals who want to insert themselves into investigations, who want to taunt authorities, who want to feel power over the people searching for them. I forwarded the email to the Portland Police Department. They thanked me for the information, said they would investigate, and advised me to be cautious with future communications. But they did not seem to take it seriously. They did not seem to believe that the email came from someone who had actually been there, who had actually witnessed Lauren's final moments. 2 weeks later, I received another message. Same anonymous email address, same cryptic subject line. "You are getting closer." This time, the message was longer, more detailed, more disturbing. You mentioned in your podcast that Lauren was wearing a green jacket. But you did not mention that the jacket had a torn left pocket, that she had repaired it with blue thread 3 days before she disappeared, that when he grabbed her, the pocket tore again, and the blue thread was left on the ground, caught on a tree root, where no one ever found it. I contacted Ashley Mitchell, Lauren's sister. I asked her about the jacket, about the torn pocket, about the blue thread. She went silent on the phone for several seconds, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "How do you know about that?" We never told anyone about the pocket. Lauren fixed it herself the weekend before she disappeared. She showed me the blue thread she used. We never mentioned it to the police because we did not think it was important. How could you possibly know about that? I told her about the emails. She started crying because if the person sending me these messages knew about the blue thread, knew about the torn pocket, knew details that were never made public, never released to the media, never documented in police reports, then they had to have been there. They had to have seen Lauren in her final moments. They had to be the person who killed her. I went to the Portland police again. I showed them the second email. I explained that the sender knew details that were not public knowledge. This time, they took me seriously. They opened a formal investigation into the emails. They requested cooperation from the email service provider to trace the origin of the messages. They assigned a detective to work with me to analyze future communications. But the emails did not stop. They became more frequent, more personal, more threatening. Over the following weeks, I received 17 messages from the same anonymous source, each one revealing details about Lauren's case that had never been made public, each one demonstrating that the sender had intimate knowledge of the crime, each one making it clear that the person responsible for Lauren's death was watching me, listening to my podcast, following my investigation. And then, in November, the emails changed. They stopped being about Lauren Mitchell. They started being about me. You have a green mug that you drink coffee from every morning. You leave your apartment at 7:45 a.m. You walk the same route to the coffee shop on Pike Street. You order the same drink every time. A large oat milk latte with 1 pump of vanilla. You sit at the same table in the back corner. You edit your podcast on your laptop while you drink your coffee. And every Wednesday, you record new episodes in the studio you rent on Capitol Hill. You think you are investigating me. But I have been investigating you. According to research on stalking behavior by criminologists, stalkers who target individuals in the public eye often engage in extensive surveillance before making direct contact. They learn routines, habits, preferences. They study their victims from a distance, gathering information that can later be used to intimidate, to threaten, to demonstrate power. I immediately contacted the police. They increased patrols near my apartment. They advised me to vary my daily routine. They suggested I consider moving to a different location temporarily. But I refused to move. I refused to let this person control my life. I refused to stop investigating Lauren's case just because someone was trying to scare me. That was a mistake. In December, I received an email with a video attachment. The file name was simply Watch Me. I hesitated before opening it, my hands shaking as I moved the cursor over the file. But I needed to know what it contained. The video was 47 seconds long, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed me walking down Pike Street, entering the coffee shop, sitting at my usual table, drinking my latte, editing my podcast. The video had been filmed 2 days earlier, on a Wednesday morning, exactly as the email had described. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been following me. Someone had been close enough to film me without my knowledge. The police ran forensic analysis on the video file. The metadata had been stripped. The origin could not be traced. The footage had been recorded on a device that left no digital fingerprint. Whoever sent it knew how to cover their tracks, knew how to remain anonymous, knew how to operate without leaving evidence. I stopped going to the coffee shop on Pike Street. I stopped maintaining predictable routines. I started varying my schedule, taking different routes, looking over my shoulder constantly. But the emails continued, and they became more specific, more invasive, more terrifying. You changed your route. Smart. But I know where you go now. I know you have been meeting with Detective Harrison from the Portland Police Department. I know you gave him copies of all my emails. I know he is trying to trace me. But he will not succeed, because I am always 3 steps ahead. I have been doing this for a long time, longer than you know, longer than anyone knows. In January of 2025, I made a decision. I would address the stalker directly on my podcast. I would dedicate an entire episode to the person sending me these messages. I would challenge them to come forward. I would ask them to explain why they were targeting me, what they wanted, what they hoped to accomplish by terrorizing me. The episode was released on January 15th. I titled it, A Message to My Stalker. In it, I spoke directly to the person who had been emailing me. I told them that I was not afraid, that I would not stop investigating Lauren Mitchell's case, that I would not be intimidated into silence. I said, if you are listening to this, if you are the person who has been sending me these messages, I want you to know that you have made a mistake. By contacting me, by revealing details about Lauren's death, you have given investigators more information than they had before. You have provided evidence that can be used to find you, to identify you, to bring you to justice. You think you are in control, but you are not. You are being hunted now, and we will find you. 3 hours after the episode went live, I received another email. The subject line read, "You should not have done that." The message itself was brief, direct, final. You think you are hunting me, but I have been hunting you, and tonight I am going to finish what I started. See you soon, Emma. I called the police immediately. I told them about the email, about the threat. They sent officers to my apartment. They positioned patrol cars on my street. They advised me not to leave my home until the threat was assessed and a security plan was implemented. But at 2:37 a.m., while the police were outside my building, while I was supposed to be safe, while I should have been protected, someone broke into my apartment. They did not smash windows. They did not force the door. They simply walked in as if they had a key, as if they had been there before, as if they knew exactly how to get inside without triggering any alarms, without making any noise, without alerting anyone to their presence. I woke up to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. The room was dark, but I could see their silhouette, backlit by the light from the hallway. They were wearing a mask, a simple black ski mask that concealed their face entirely, and they were holding something. In the darkness, I could not tell what it was, but the shape was unmistakable, a knife. They spoke, their voice distorted, mechanically altered, unrecognizable. You wanted to find me, Emma. Now you have. But you were wrong about something. You said I was being hunted. You said you would bring me to justice, but you did not understand. I am not running from you. I never was. You have been running toward me. Every podcast episode, every interview, every case you investigated, you were getting closer. And I let you, because I wanted you to find me, because I wanted you here, at this moment, alone, terrified, realizing that everything you thought you knew was wrong. According to documented cases of offenders who target investigators, many serial criminals develop obsessions with the people who investigate their crimes. They see the investigators as adversaries in a game, as opponents to be outwitted, as challenges to be overcome. They insert themselves into investigations. They provide information. They taunt and threaten, all while maintaining control over the narrative, over the investigation. I screamed, the intruder lunged forward, and I rolled off the bed, hitting the floor hard, scrambling toward the door. I could hear them behind me, could hear footsteps, could hear breathing, could feel them reaching for me. I made it to the hallway, slammed the bedroom door behind me, ran toward the front door where the police officers were supposed to be waiting, where I was supposed to be safe. The door was locked from the outside. The officers were gone, and I realized, with a horror that froze me in place, that the person in my apartment had sent them away, had convinced them to leave, had created a diversion that pulled them off my building just long enough to get inside, to trap me, to finish what they had promised to finish. I do not remember how I escaped. The police found me 3 blocks away, running down the street in my pajamas, hysterical, incoherent. They searched my apartment. They found the bedroom window open. They found evidence that someone had been inside, but the intruder was gone, vanished. as if they had never been there. The police launched a full investigation. They assigned protective custody. They moved me to a safe house. But the emails continued, and now they were coming from multiple accounts, from different sources, as if the stalker had multiplied, as if there were now several people watching me, following me, hunting me, or, as I came to realize with growing dread, as if the stalker wanted me to believe there were multiple people, wanted me to feel surrounded, wanted me to understand that I could not escape, that no matter where I went, no matter how many precautions I took, they would find me. Because the final email I received, the one that arrived yesterday, made everything clear. You were right about one thing, Emma. You are being hunted, but not by the police, by me, and the reason I have been watching you, the reason I have been sending you all these messages, the reason I broke into your apartment, is because you have something I want. You have attention. You have an audience. You have thousands of people who listen to your podcast every week, and I want them to listen to me. So, here's what is going to happen. You are going to record one more episode, and in that episode, you are going to tell them everything. You are going to tell them about Lauren Mitchell, about how she died, about how I killed her, about how I have killed 8 others over the past 6 years. And you are going to tell them that if they want to know more, they need to keep listening, because I am going to start sending you information about all of them. Every victim, every detail, every moment. And you are going to share it. Because if you do not, I will come back. And next time, you will not escape. I am writing this because I do not know what else to do. The police say they are close to identifying the stalker. They say the emails have provided enough information to narrow down suspects. They say an arrest is imminent. But I know better, because the person who has been stalking me, the person who killed Lauren Mitchell, the person who has been watching me for months, is not someone who makes mistakes, is not someone who leaves evidence, is not someone who will be caught by traditional investigative methods. They are someone who understands how investigations work, who knows how to manipulate the system, who has been playing this game for years, and they are someone who has chosen me, specifically because my podcast gives them a platform, gives them an audience, gives them a way to control the narrative of their crimes. I have stopped recording episodes. I have taken my podcast offline. I have refused to give this person what they want. But I know that will not stop them. They will find another way to reach me, another way to force me to participate in whatever twisted game they are playing. Because they are not interested in being caught. They are interested in being heard. And they have decided that I am the person who will tell their story. If you're reading this, if you listen to true crime podcasts, if you follow unsolved cases, please understand that not everyone who contacts investigators is trying to help. Some people are trying to insert themselves into the investigation. Some people are trying to manipulate the narrative. Some people are trying to use your attention, your interest, your fascination with crime to give themselves power, to give themselves control, to give themselves an audience. The person who has been stalking me is still out there. They are still watching. They are still listening. And I do not know how much longer I can resist their demands. Because every day I refuse, every day I stay silent, is another day they are planning. Another day they are hunting. Another day they are getting closer to making good on their threats. I am writing this from a hospital bed in Denver, Colorado, where I have been for the past 3 weeks, recovering from injuries that doctors cannot fully explain, injuries that have no medical precedent, injuries that should not exist. My name is Richard Thornton, and I am a real estate developer based in Boulder, Colorado. For 32 years, I built luxury homes, high-end condominiums, exclusive residential communities. I made millions. I destroyed dozens of historic properties. I never once felt guilty. Until the Patterson house. The story begins in April of 2024, when I purchased a property at 2400 Oak Street in Boulder, a historic Victorian mansion built in 1893 by a family named Patterson. The house had been on the market for 6 months, listed at $800,000. far below market value for the location. The reason for the low price was simple. The house was protected by local historic preservation laws. The previous owners had tried to demolish it and been blocked by the city council. Multiple preservation groups had fought to save the building, and anyone who bought it would be required to maintain its original architecture, its period details, its historical integrity. But I saw an opportunity, because while the house itself was protected, the land beneath it was not, and the lot was large, over half an acre, in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Boulder, within walking distance of Pearl Street, surrounded by multi-million-dollar homes. If I could find a way around the preservation laws, if I could get the house demolished, I could subdivide the lot, build 3 modern luxury homes, sell them for $2 million each, make a profit of over $4 million. According to research on historic preservation law, buildings can lose protected status if they are deemed structurally unsound, if they pose a safety hazard, if the cost of restoration exceeds 60% of the property's assessed value. So my plan was simple. I would purchase the house, hire inspectors who would find structural issues, document safety hazards, estimate astronomical restoration costs, and petition the city to remove the historic designation. Once the designation was removed, I could demolish the house, clear the lot, and begin construction. I closed on the property in May, paid cash, $750,000, and immediately began the process of documenting every flaw, every crack, every sign of deterioration in the Patterson house. I hired structural engineers who confirmed foundation settling, roof damage, outdated electrical systems, plumbing issues. I hired environmental specialists who found asbestos in the insulation, lead paint on the walls, mold in the basement. I compiled a report that estimated restoration costs at over $1 million, more than the house was worth, more than any rational person would spend to save it. In June, I submitted my petition to the Boulder Historic Preservation Board, requesting that the Patterson house be removed from the historic register, that I be granted permission to demolish the structure, that the lot be released for redevelopment. The Preservation Board scheduled a public hearing for July 15th. But before the hearing could take place, something happened. The house began to resist. It started small. Tools that I left inside the house would disappear. Hammers, screwdrivers, measuring tapes, only to reappear days later in different rooms, in places I had not been. Doors that I left open would close themselves. Windows that I closed would open. Lights that I turned off would turn back on. I attributed it to wind, to settling, to old house quirks. But then the problems escalated. In late June, I hired a demolition consultant to assess the interior, to determine the best strategy for bringing the house down once approval was granted. He spent 3 hours inside the Patterson house, taking photographs, making measurements, planning the demolition sequence. When he came out, his face was pale. His hands were shaking, and he told me he would not be working on the project. I asked him why. He said, "That house does not want to be torn down, and if you are smart, Mr. Thornton, you will walk away from this deal before it is too late." I dismissed his concerns. I told him he was being irrational, that houses do not have wants or desires, that they are structures made of wood and stone and glass, that they do not resist or fight back. I told him I would find another demolition consultant, someone less superstitious, someone more professional. But I could not find anyone else willing to work on the project. Every contractor I contacted, every engineer I approached, every specialist I hired, they all refused after visiting the house. Some gave vague excuses, claimed scheduling conflicts, said they were too busy. Others were more direct. They said the house felt wrong, that they experienced headaches, nausea, disorientation while inside, that they heard voices, saw shadows, felt presences watching them. According to research on allegedly haunted properties, approximately 40% of real estate agents report having encountered homes they believe were paranormally active. But hauntings, if they exist, are typically attributed to traumatic events, violent deaths, emotional residue left by previous occupants. The Patterson house had no such history. No one had died there. No crimes had been committed there. No tragic events had occurred there. It was simply an old house that had been home to multiple generations of a family. A house where children had been raised, holidays had been celebrated, ordinary life had unfolded for over a century. So why did everyone who entered it feel such overwhelming dread? Why did they describe feeling watched, judged, rejected? In July, 2 days before the Preservation Board hearing, I decided to spend the night in the Patterson house. I wanted to understand what everyone else was experiencing. I wanted to confront whatever psychological phenomenon was causing these reactions. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing supernatural about the building, that it was just an old house with creaky floors and drafty windows and nothing more. I arrived at 8 p.m., brought a sleeping bag, a flashlight, my phone, and a bottle of whiskey to calm my nerves. The house was empty. All the furniture had been removed by the previous owners. All that remained was dust, peeling wallpaper, scuffed hardwood floors. I set up in what had been the living room, spread out my sleeping bag, poured a drink, and waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The house was quiet, still, exactly as I expected. But then, around 9:15 p.m., I heard something. Footsteps. On the floor above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, walking from one end of the second floor to the other. I called out, asked if anyone was there, received no response. I grabbed my flashlight and went upstairs. The second floor was empty. 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, all vacant. No one was there. But as I stood in the hallway, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were coming from the floor below me, back in the living room, where I had just been. I went back downstairs. The living room was empty. My sleeping bag was exactly where I had left it. But something had changed. On the wall, written in what looked like dust or ash, were 2 words: "Remember us." According to folklore documented by paranormal researchers, homes that are threatened with demolition sometimes exhibit increased paranormal activity, as if the structure itself is trying to communicate, to plead for its survival, to remind the living of what will be lost if it is destroyed. But this was not folklore. This was happening in real time. To me, I tried to wipe the words away, but they would not come off. The dust was not on the surface of the wall. It was embedded in it, as if the wall itself had written the message. I pulled out my phone to take a photograph, but when I looked at the screen, the message was different. Now it read, "We were happy here." I backed away from the wall, my heart pounding, and that is when I heard them. Voices, multiple voices, speaking all at once, not from any one direction, but from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling, as if the house was speaking. Children's voices, adult voices, old voices, young voices, all saying the same thing: do not take our home. Research on residual hauntings suggests that buildings can retain emotional imprints of past events, that traumatic or emotionally significant moments can be recorded in the physical structure, replaying like echoes for those sensitive enough to perceive them. But this was not a residual haunting. This was interactive. This was directed at me. This was the house itself, or the memories within it, actively resisting what I planned to do. I left the Patterson house at 10:30 p.m., 3 hours earlier than I had planned, and I did not return until the Preservation Board hearing on July 15th. At the hearing, I presented my case, showed photographs of structural damage, presented engineering reports estimating restoration costs, argued that the house was beyond saving, that demolition was the only viable option. The Preservation Board listened, asked questions, deliberated for 2 hours, and then delivered their verdict. Denied. The Patterson house would retain its historic designation. Demolition would not be permitted. I would need to either restore the property or sell it to someone who would. I was furious. I had invested $750,000 in a property I could not develop, could not modify, could not tear down. I had spent months documenting damage, compiling reports, preparing arguments, and I had been denied by a board of bureaucrats who cared more about preserving old buildings than about property rights, than about economic development, than about my freedom to do what I wanted with land I owned. So I made a decision. I would demolish the house anyway, without permission. At night, when no one would see, I would hire a crew, bring in equipment, tear down the structure in a single night, and deal with the legal consequences later. Pay the fines, face the lawsuits. It did not matter. Once the house was gone, once the lot was cleared, the preservation board could not force me to rebuild it. And I would still be able to subdivide the land, build my luxury homes, make my profit. On July 28th at midnight, I brought a demolition crew to the Patterson house. 5 men, experienced in emergency demolitions, willing to work off the books for triple their normal rate. They set up lights, brought in excavators, prepared to begin the demolition. But when the first excavator approached the house, when the metal claw reached toward the front wall, something happened that I still cannot explain. The excavator stopped. The engine died. The operator tried to restart it, but nothing happened. The machine was dead. So they brought in the second excavator. Same result. Engine failure. No explanation. The crew chief suggested we use manual demolition tools, sledgehammers, pry bars, to begin breaking down the interior walls before attempting mechanized demolition. So, the 5 men entered the house with their tools, and I stayed outside, watching from my car, waiting for the sound of breaking wood, shattering glass, collapsing walls. But, instead, I heard screaming. All 5 men ran out of the house within minutes, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. One of them was bleeding from his forehead, another was holding his arm, another was limping. They refused to tell me what happened, refused to go back inside, refused to go back inside, refused to continue the demolition. They loaded their equipment, drove away, and left me standing alone in front of the Patterson house at 1:15 a.m. I went inside. I needed to see what had frightened them. I needed to understand what force was protecting this building. I walked through the front door into the entry hall, and that is when I felt it. A presence, not hostile, not angry, just sad, profoundly, overwhelmingly sad, as if the house itself was mourning. And then I saw them. Figures, translucent, barely visible in the darkness, standing in every room. Men, women, children, elderly people, all dressed in clothing from different eras, from the 1800s, from the 1900s, from decades past. They were not moving, not speaking, just standing there, looking at me with expressions of such sorrow that I felt my chest tighten, felt tears form in my eyes, felt guilt for the first time in my life. According to documented cases of property-related hauntings, buildings that house multiple generations of a family often retain emotional connections to all who lived there, creating a collective memory, a shared history that transcends individual lives. The Patterson house was not haunted by one ghost. It was haunted by an entire family, by everyone who had ever called it home, by children who had grown up there, by adults who had raised families there, by elderly people who had died peacefully in their beds there. And they were all asking me the same question. Why? Why did I want to destroy their home? Why did I value profit over history? Why did I think I had the right to erase 130 years of memories, 130 years of lives lived, 130 years of love and loss in ordinary human experience? I tried to speak, tried to justify my actions, tried to explain that it was just business, just economics, just the way development worked in a growing city. But before I could say anything, the floor beneath me began to crack. The walls began to shake. The ceiling began to splinter. And I realized too late that the house was not trying to scare me away. It was trying to bury me. The house collapsed. Not gradually. Not structurally. It collapsed all at once, as if every beam, every joist, every support had decided simultaneously to give way. I was buried under wood, Plaster, brick, glass, metal, buried alive in the ruins of a building I had tried to destroy. The fire department found me 6 hours later, at 7:30 a.m., when neighbors reported the collapse. I had 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, lacerations across my face and arms, internal bleeding. But I was alive. Barely. The official investigation concluded that the house had been structurally compromised by my attempts to document damage, that my engineers had weakened load-bearing walls during their inspections, that the collapse was accidental, caused by my own negligence. I was fined, sued by the city, charged with illegal demolition activities, and ordered to pay for the removal of debris, the restoration of the lot. But I know the truth. The Patterson house did not collapse because of structural damage. It collapsed because I tried to destroy it. It collapsed to punish me, to show me that some things are worth more than money, that some places hold value beyond economic calculation, that history, memory, family, these things cannot be bulldozed and replaced with luxury condominiums without consequences. I am writing this as a warning to other developers, to other people who see old buildings as obstacles, as inconveniences, as impediments to progress. Some houses remember. They remember everyone who lived there, everyone who loved them, everyone who called them home. And when you try to erase that memory, when you try to destroy what they represent, they will fight back. The Patterson house is gone now. The lot has been cleared, sold to a preservation group that plans to build a memorial garden, a public space honoring the families who lived there for over a century. I will never develop that land. I will never profit from it. And I will carry these injuries, these scars, for the rest of my life, as reminders that some crimes are punished not by law, but by something older, something deeper, something that exists in the walls of houses that remember everything. I want to tell you something that psychiatrists and researchers have documented for decades, something that very few people outside of clinical circles ever hear about. There is a condition called shared psychotic disorder, known in French as folie familiale, meaning the madness of many. It was first described in the 1800s by European psychiatrists, who observed how a single person's delusion, when held with enough force and conviction, can transmit itself to everyone around them like a contagion. The people who absorb it are not weak. They are not stupid. They simply love someone who is sick, and they trust what they see. What I'm about to tell you is a story about a woman named Claire Mercer, who lived in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, Oregon. Whether what happened to her was a product of her own fractured mind, or something far more sinister involving the people closest to her, I will leave for you to decide. Claire was 31 years old when she first started noticing things that did not make sense. She lived alone in a small 2-bedroom house on Alderton Street, worked remotely as a content editor for a marketing firm, and by every measure led a quiet, self-sufficient life. She was not impulsive. She was not, as she would later emphasize to anyone who would listen, the kind of person who imagined things. She had a small circle of close friends, a mother named Donna, who lived 20 minutes away, and a neighbor across the street named Vera, who had watched over Claire since she moved in at 27. These were the people who formed the boundaries of her daily world, and these were the very people who would eventually make her question whether she was losing her mind entirely. It started in the produce section of a Safeway on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Claire had been reaching for a bag of salad greens when the store manager, a heavy-set man named Dale, who always wore the same maroon polo shirt, stopped her mid-aisle and asked in a completely natural tone, as if he was asking about the weather, how the baby was doing. Claire looked at him. She laughed a little, assuming he had confused her with another customer. She told him she did not have a baby. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something mildly peculiar. A brief pause, a recalibration, and then he smiled and said, "Of course. Of course. Take care of yourself." She walked out of the store with a strange feeling she could not name, a kind of low-level static behind her eyes. She told herself he had simply mixed her up with someone else. People mix up customers all the time. She went home, made dinner, and forgot about it by morning. 3 days later, her mother called. Donna had a warm but intense personality, the kind of woman who communicated love through questions, through checking in, through a constant gentle current of attention. They spoke every few days. On this particular call, about 7 minutes in, her mother asked if the baby was sleeping better. Claire went very still. She said, "What did you just say?" Her mother repeated it without hesitation, asked if little Iris was sleeping through the night yet, because she had read that at this age, some babies were starting to establish better sleep patterns. Claire's hands were shaking when she said, "Mom, I do not have a baby. I do not have a child. I have never been pregnant." There was a pause on the other end, a long one. Then her mother, in a careful and measured voice, asked if Claire was feeling okay, and suggested maybe she should get some rest. That was when Claire understood with absolute certainty that something was very wrong. She spent the next 4 days in a state of controlled panic, methodically working her way through her contacts, calling friends and acquaintances and even a former colleague from 2 years ago, framing conversations carefully to see if anyone else would reference a baby. 2 of them did. Her friend Megan, who lived in Northeast Portland, asked how Iris was adjusting to the new crib. Her neighbor Vera brought over a casserole and said she sometimes heard little Iris crying in the evenings and hoped she was not keeping Claire up at night. Claire stood in her own doorway, holding the casserole dish, looking at a woman she had known for 4 years, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. She asked Vera directly, her voice as calm as she could make it, what the baby's name was. Vera answered without blinking. "Iris. About 4 months old now," she said. "Your whole face changes when you talk about her." Claire had not talked about her at all. She began to document everything, the way someone documents things when they know they will need proof later and are terrified they will not find it. She wrote every conversation down in a notes app on her phone with timestamps. She re-examined her house room by room. In the second bedroom, the one she used as a storage space for boxes of books and old equipment, she found a white crib positioned next to the window, with the blinds half open. A pale yellow changing table sat against the wall. Folded on the shelf above it were tiny onesies, a pale green one and a white one with small gray elephants printed across the chest. On the floor beside the crib was a baby monitor, its green light blinking steadily in the afternoon quiet. Claire did not move for a very long time. Then she picked up the monitor and walked to the kitchen and set it down on the counter and stared at it until her legs stopped trembling. She had not assembled that crib. She had not purchased any of those items. She did not know how they had gotten into her house. She tried to tell herself there was a rational explanation, that someone had broken in and staged the room as a prank, though she could not imagine who would do such a thing or why. She changed her locks the following morning. She called a locksmith she found online and watched him work in silence and paid him cash. She told him nothing. She was beginning to feel a paranoia she recognized as dangerous, the kind that causes people to stop sounding credible to others, the kind that can turn a reasonable person into someone easy to dismiss. And she did not want to be dismissed. She wanted to be believed. The photographs appeared on her phone approximately 2 weeks after she first found the crib. She had not backed up her phone recently, which meant she could not compare a clean archive to what was there now. Scattered among her camera roll, amid photos of meals and sunsets and screenshots, were images of an infant she did not recognize, a tiny girl with dark hair and half-closed eyes, sleeping in what appeared to be the crib in Claire's second bedroom, pressed against Claire's own shoulder at what looked like a kitchen table, photographed from above in a white bath towel. The metadata on each image listed Claire's iPhone as the originating device. The location data placed them inside her house. The timestamp stretched back nearly 4 months. She sat in her car in the parking lot of a Target on Northeast Sandy Boulevard and scrolled through photograph after photograph of a baby she did not know, and she began to cry in a way she had not cried since her father died, the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep to reach with words. She went to see her mother in person. She needed to see Donna's face when she asked the questions. Her mother opened the door and smiled and hugged her, and immediately asked if she had brought Iris, because she had wanted to take some photos of the two of them together. Claire walked past her into the kitchen and sat down at the table and placed her phone in front of her mother with the camera roll open. She asked her mother to tell her what she saw. Her mother looked at the photographs and her face softened with the particular tenderness people reserve for newborns, and she said, "She is just precious, Claire. She is so much bigger than the last time I saw her." Claire took the phone back. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she asked her mother if she had ever actually held Iris. Her mother said yes, of course, the night Claire had called her over because Iris would not stop crying and she was exhausted. Claire asked when that had been. Her mother said, 3 weeks ago, the Tuesday after Easter. Claire had been on a work call that Tuesday. She had notes. She had the calendar entry. She had a recording of the call she had flagged for her team. She did not sleep that night. The psychiatric literature on postpartum psychosis describes a condition that can emerge within days to the first 6 weeks after childbirth, characterized by confusion, delusions, disorganized thinking, and a terrifying loss of contact with reality. Medical researchers at Cleveland Clinic have documented cases in which patients experience what clinicians call a dissociative break from their own experiences, a fracturing of memory so complete that the person cannot reconcile what is real from what the illness has constructed. But postpartum psychosis requires a pregnancy. Claire had not been pregnant. She had not given birth. Her body showed no physical evidence of any of it, and yet here was a camera roll full of photographs. Here was a crib assembled in her spare room. Here was her mother, her neighbor, her closest friend, all describing the same infant with the same name, with the same quiet certainty of people who know what they know. There is also in the clinical record a condition documented since the 1800s. Folia familia, family madness, a phenomenon in which one person's delusion spreads outward through close emotional relationships, infecting those who love them with the same false conviction. Psychiatrists who have studied it describe how the secondary participants do not manufacture the belief consciously, they absorb it. They fill in the gaps with what they had been told, with what they have observed, with what they trust. The distinction between being gaslit and being caught inside someone else's delusion can be, from the inside, almost impossible to measure. Claire did not know any of this yet. What she knew was that she was standing in the second bedroom of her house on a Thursday afternoon in early May, and she was looking at a crib, and she was listening to what she had been told about herself, and she could feel something inside her beginning to tear, not break tear, the way fabric tears when you pull it from 2 directions at once, cleanly in some places, ragged in others. She picked up the baby monitor from the shelf where she had placed it after bringing it back from the kitchen. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she was considering, and she considered it anyway. Then she lifted it above her head and drove it into the side of the crib. Once, and then again, until the crib had collapsed into itself, and the pieces were scattered across the floor, and her hands were shaking, and she was standing in the middle of the room, and there was absolute silence. Her neighbor Vera called her phone 4 minutes later. She said she had heard a crash and wanted to make sure Claire was all right. She said, "Is Iris okay? Did something fall? Are you both all right in there?" Claire sat down on the floor among the broken pieces of a crib she had never assembled, and she said, "I do not know. I genuinely do not know." She has since moved to a different city. The second bedroom sits empty in a house that now belongs to someone else. She entered therapy with a specialist who works at the intersection of trauma and dissociative disorders. Her therapist has told her, carefully and without leaning too hard in either direction, that 2 things can both be true at once. that she may have experienced a psychotic episode with no memory of it, and that the people around her may have reinforced that episode in ways that made it impossible for her to find the edge of it and crawl back. The name they use for that reinforcement in the clinical literature is induced delusional disorder. The name Claire uses for it is something she does not say out loud. What I want to leave you with is this. Psychiatrists who study shared delusion have noted something that should unsettle all of us. There is no clear clinical line between a belief held by many and a mass delusion. When enough people believe the same false thing about you, it stops feeling like their error. It starts feeling like your own. And if you cannot trust your memory, and you cannot trust the people who love you, and you cannot trust the photographs on your own phone, the only thing left to question is yourself. Claire still does not know the truth, and there are nights, she has said, when she is not entirely sure which outcome would be worse. There is a case that has never fully left me, not because it is the most violent, not because it is the most dramatic, but because of one detail, one quiet, impossible detail that investigators, reporters, and the family of the missing person have never been able to explain. In December of 2020, a 21-year-old college student named Jason Landry crashed his car on a rural road in Caldwell County, Texas, and vanished. When investigators reached the scene, his vehicle was empty. The road was dark and cold, and there, a few dozen feet from the wreck, they found his clothes, not scattered, not torn, folded, placed, arranged with a neatness that suggested someone had taken them off carefully, the way you take off your clothes before bed. His shirt was there, his watch, face up, placed beneath it like a gift on a nightstand. His sandals, his socks. Everything he had been wearing was there on that road, folded and ordered and empty. Jason Landry was never found. Investigators used drones, infrared technology, and extensive ground searches, and still could not explain how a man removed every piece of clothing on a cold rural road at night and then simply ceased to exist. I tell you this because it is the closest real-world parallel I have found to what happened to a woman named Nora Ellison in a farmhouse outside of Harlan, Kentucky, on a Tuesday morning in October. And because the thing on Nora's bed was not clothing alone, Nora was 24 years old, the younger of two daughters, and she had lived her whole life in the same farmhouse her grandparents built in the 1950s. Long white porch, 3 bedrooms, a well at the back of the yard that the family had stopped using when the county water came in, but that nobody had ever filled. Nora worked remotely, designing graphics for a small firm in Lexington. She had a cat named Slate. She called her mother Diane every Sunday without fail. She was not, by any measure, a person at risk of disappearing. On the Monday evening before she vanished, her older sister Claire drove out to visit. They made dinner together, watched television, argued pleasantly about whether the farmhouse needed new gutters. Claire left around 9. She remembered later that Nora had walked her to her car and stood on the porch and waved until the headlights were gone. That was the last anyone saw her. Tuesday morning, Diane called at 9. No answer. She called again at 9:30, and then again at 10, and then she called Claire, who lived 40 minutes away, and said in the voice that mothers use when they are not yet frightened but are preparing to be, that something felt wrong. Claire drove out. The front door was unlocked, which was not unusual. The farmhouse had not been locked in 20 years. Inside, everything was quiet. Slate the cat was sitting in the kitchen, fed, and calm. The coffee maker had started its automatic cycle and completed it. A half-full mug sat on the counter, still faintly warm. Claire called Nora's name through the house. No answer. She went upstairs to the bedroom. The door was open. The morning light came in through the curtains the way it always did, thin and gold, laying a strip of warmth across the floor. Nora's bed was made, neatly, precisely, the kind of making that looks deliberate rather than habitual. And on top of the quilt, arranged with a care that Claire could not account for, were Nora's things, her pajamas, folded flat, the way laundry is folded before it is put away. Her silver bracelet, the one she never took off, coiled gently on top of the fabric. Her earrings, small pearl studs, placed side by side beside the bracelet. Her phone, screen down, aligned with the edge of the folded fabric as though someone had taken a moment to make sure it was straight. And beside all of it, dry and paper-thin and unmistakable, was a shed snakeskin. 4 feet long at least, intact from head to tail, still shaped like the thing that had lived inside it, translucent and hollow and perfect. Not a fragment. The whole thing, placed with the same quiet deliberateness as everything else on that bed, as though it belonged there. Claire stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not touch anything. She did not know why she did not touch anything. She said later in the account she gave to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department that the room felt like something she should not disturb, like a sentence she was not supposed to finish. She called 911. The deputies who responded were professional and thorough. They searched the house, the outbuildings, the yard, the tree line at the edge of the property. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No sign of struggle. No footprints in the damp earth outside the windows that did not belong to people they could account for. The well at the back of the yard was dry. Nora was simply not there. The snakeskin was examined. It belonged to a black rat snake, native to the region, non-venomous. There was no explanation for how it had arrived on the bed. The bedroom windows were latched from the inside. The closet door was closed. Slate the cat, who was known to bring offerings of small animals to family members with some regularity, was physically incapable of carrying an intact 4-foot snake skin up a flight of stairs and arranging it beside folded pajamas. That was the conclusion investigators kept returning to. The word arranged. Everything on that bed had been arranged. Investigators explored every rational explanation. A planned disappearance, a personal crisis, an argument no one had witnessed. They examined Nora's financial records and her messages and her search history. They spoke to her colleagues and her friends and the man she had quietly been seeing for several months, who was accounted for and cooperative and visibly devastated. They found nothing that pointed toward a reason to leave and nothing that pointed toward foul play. The Isdale woman case in Norway offers one of the most chilling documented examples of a person who seemed to have deliberately erased themselves before vanishing. The labels cut from every piece of clothing, the manufacturing marks scraped from every personal item, the systematic removal of every detail that could identify her. Investigators on Nora's case noted one detail that echoed this. Nora's laptop was on the desk, open, powered down. When forensics accessed it, they found the browser history had been cleared, not recently, systematically over the past several months on a schedule, as though someone had been maintaining that absence of record the way you maintain a habit. The phone on the bed yielded nothing useful. Its last activity was a text to Claire at 8:47 the previous evening. It said only, "Drive safe. Talk soon." The phrasing was normal. The timing was normal. The period at the end was not something Nora typically used in texts to her sister, but it was such a small thing that Claire had not noticed it at the time. She noticed it afterward. Diane, Nora's mother, gave a recorded interview to a local journalist 3 months after the disappearance. She said something that has stayed with me. She said that the hardest part was not the not knowing. It was the knowing that Nora had stood on the porch and waved until the headlights were gone. She said it felt like a goodbye. She said it felt, looking back, like someone making sure the last image anyone had of her was a good one. I want to tell you something about snakeskin. A snake does not shed because it is dying. It sheds because it has grown. Because the outer layer no longer fits the thing inside it. Because the thing inside it has become something the old skin cannot contain. The shed skin is not the snake. It is evidence of what the snake was, before it became whatever it is now. Investigators on the Nora Ellison case were divided in their private conversations. on one question: whether the snake skin was left as a message or as a clue, whether someone was telling the family what had happened, or whether Nora herself was telling them something about who she had been. Nora has not been found. The case is listed as an open missing persons investigation with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Her mother still calls the investigator's office every month. Her sister Claire has not been back to the farmhouse. The bed has not been changed, and somewhere in the memory of a Tuesday morning in October, a young woman's things are arranged on a quilt, in the quiet gold light, folded and still and perfectly ordered, as though someone took enormous care to leave nothing behind that mattered, except the skin. The skin was left on purpose. I am certain of that. I just cannot tell you what it was supposed to mean.
Before I read you this,
I want to tell you about a case that most people have never heard of, but that every security professional and true crime researcher I have spoken to considers one of the most quietly terrifying documented incidents in modern American criminal history. In December of 2010, a woman in Modesto, California, plugged her cell phone in to charge overnight on her bedside table, the way most of us do every single night of our lives. And when she woke up in the morning, the phone was gone. She called the police. They searched her house. In the attic, hidden beneath blown insulation, they found a 27-year-old man named Miguel Lua, her ex-boyfriend, who had been living there for an unknown period of time. He had taken the phone, police determined, to scroll through her contacts and her messages while she slept a few feet beneath him. He had been up there, above her bedroom ceiling, listening to her breathe, for long enough that investigators could not determine when it had started. That detail, the inability to find a beginning, is the part that has stayed with me. There was no first night they could identify. He had been there long enough that the starting point had dissolved into ordinary time. What I am about to read you is an account submitted to a personal safety forum in 2019 by a young woman named Cassie Whitmore, who was 17 years old when this happened to her, and who asked that the town not be identified and that only her first name be used, and who said, at the end of her account, that she still cannot watch a horror movie set in a house without her hands going cold. I was not supposed to be home that Halloween. My best friend Lauren had been planning her annual party for 6 weeks, and I had promised, after skipping it the year before, that I would be there no matter what. But my parents had a dinner reservation they had made months in advance, and my little sister was spending the night at my grandmother's, and someone had to stay home to hand out candy, and that someone turned out to be me. I called Lauren from the couch in my Halloween costume, a witch's hat I had not bothered to put on, holding a bowl of miniature Snickers I had already started eating. She was understanding about it, the way Lauren always was, which somehow made it worse. I told her I would call her later. I told myself the night would be fine. Our house was a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of street where every house has a porch light and a doorbell camera and a neighbor who knows your parents by first name. The kind of street where nothing happens. The kind of street people describe as safe when they mean that nothing bad has happened yet, and they are hoping that continues. The porch light was on. The candy bowl was full. I had my phone, my laptop, and the television, and I was 17 years old and perfectly capable of being alone for a few hours on a Tuesday night in late October. The first trick-or-treaters came at 6:30, in a group, a cluster of small superheroes and princesses, shepherded by a tired father in a fleece vest, who thanked me twice and herded them back down the porch steps before they could ask for more. They came in waves after that, every 10 or 12 minutes, and I settled into the pleasant, repetitive rhythm of opening the door and dispensing candy and telling the costumes they were terrifying, even when they were not. I was on the phone with my boyfriend Ryan at around 7:45, and he was pretending to be jealous about the miniature Snickers, and I was laughing, and the night felt easy and ordinary, the way Halloween nights feel when you are young and warm and the only thing outside is children in costumes. That was when I heard the sound from upstairs. Not a loud sound. That is the part I always have to clarify when I describe it. because people imagine a crash, or a thump, or something dramatic, and it was not any of those things. It was a creak, a single creak from the direction of the upstairs hallway, the kind of sound old houses make in cold weather, the kind of sound that has 100 explanations and does not, on its own, mean anything at all. I registered it the way you register a sound that fits inside the existing noise of a house, filed it, and kept talking to Ryan. 2 minutes later, there was another one. Different location. That was what made my body notice before my mind did. The first creak had come from the direction of the hall linen closet. The second one came from further down, nearer to the master bedroom, and between those 2 points was a distance of perhaps 15 feet. And something had moved that 15 feet in 2 minutes, slowly, in the way that things move when they are trying not to make sound, and are not entirely succeeding. I stopped mid-sentence. Ryan asked what was wrong. I told him I had heard something upstairs. He said it was probably the house settling, which was what I had been telling myself, and hearing it in someone else's voice should have been reassuring. But it was not, because what I had registered, in the part of my nervous system that processes information before the rational brain has the chance to explain it away, was not the sound of a house settling. It was the sound of weight shifting, incrementally and carefully and in a direction. I want to tell you something about what the body does in moments like that. Before the mind is caught up, it does not panic. Panic comes later when the mind joins the conversation. What the body does first is go very quiet and very specific. My breathing slowed. My grip on the phone tightened until I could feel my pulse in my fingers. My eyes went to the staircase at the end of the hall, which I could see from the couch and which was dark above the landing. And the dark at the top of those stairs looked different to me than it had 30 seconds before. Not visually different. Atmospherically different. The way a room feels different when someone has just left it, or is about to enter it. A density to the air that I do not know how to describe as anything other than the presence of another person. I told Ryan quietly that I thought there was someone upstairs. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was impossible, that the doors were locked, that I was spooked because it was Halloween, that I was alone in a safe neighborhood and there was no reason for anyone to be in my house. He said all of this in the calm, reasonable voice of someone who is not in the house, and every word of it was correct, and none of it helped me at all. I went to the bottom of the stairs. I did not go up them. I stood at the foot with my phone pressed to my ear, and I looked up at the dark at the top of the landing, and I said, loudly enough to carry, "Is someone up there?" My voice was steadier than I expected, which surprised me, and I filed that surprise away as something to think about later. Nothing answered. The house was silent in the particular way that a house is silent when you have just made a noise and are listening hard to what fills the space after it. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted them. Then, from the direction of the upstairs hallway, there was a third creak. I stepped back from the stairs. I walked to the front door, which was dead bolted, and I checked it without knowing I was going to, the way you do things before you have decided to do them. It was locked. I walked to the back door in the kitchen. Locked. The garage door was down. Every exterior entry point was exactly as I had left it when my parents walked out 2 hours before. The house was secured. No one had come in through a door. No one had come in through a window, all of which were lashed against the October chill. The rational explanation for the sounds upstairs required an entry point that did not exist, and the irrational explanation required a person who had been inside the house before I secured it, before my parents left, before the evening began. I called 911. The dispatcher was calm and efficient, and she told me to stay on the line and go to the front door and step outside onto the porch, and I did exactly that. And I stood in my porch in my witch's hat with the candy bowl on the railing beside me, and the neighborhood children moving from house to house in the October dark, and I could see my own lit windows from outside, and the upstairs windows were dark and showed nothing, and I felt simultaneously completely ridiculous and completely certain that I had been right to call. The 2 officers arrived in 6 minutes. I watched them park, and walk up my porch, and I let them in with my key, and they went upstairs with their flashlights while I stayed in the front doorway, 1 foot on the threshold, watching the staircase. I heard them moving through the rooms. I heard closets opening. I heard the measured, methodical sound of a space being checked by people who know how to check spaces. And then I heard one of them say something to the other in a low voice. And I heard the other one respond. And there was a pause. And then one of the officers came to the top of the stairs and looked down at me and asked me to stay where I was. They found him in the attic. Access to our attic is through a hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs linen closet behind the extra towels on the top shelf. It is the kind of hatch that most people, in most houses, never open, because the only reason to access it is if something in the attic needs attention, and nothing in ours had needed attention in the 3 years since we moved in. The hatch had been pushed open from below and left ajar by perhaps 2 inches, and inside the attic, when they climbed up, they found the evidence of an occupation they could not precisely date. A sleeping bag, folded flat against the insulation. A water bottle. A small zippered bag containing personal items. A phone charger. And, resting on the insulation directly above the master bedroom, a section where the dust had been compressed, repeatedly, by a person lying flat for extended periods, positioned above a small gap in the insulation where a heating grate allowed sound to pass clearly between the attic floor and the room below. He had been listening through the ceiling. The man they took out of my attic that night was not, as far as investigators could determine, known to my family. He had a prior arrest in another county for a similar incident, involving an ex-girlfriend whose crawl space he had occupied for an unspecified period, before her neighbors noticed unfamiliar movement around the back of her house and called the police. In both cases, entry was through an exterior attic vent at the rear of the house that had a damaged screen. In both cases, the method of movement was patient and slow, and timed to the rhythms of the household below. In my case, the investigators estimated he had likely been in our attic for somewhere between 3 and 7 days, based on the items found and the condition of the sleeping bag. 3 to 7 days of Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Saturdays and ordinary evenings, of family dinners and arguments about homework and my parents watching television after 10, of everything that happens in a house when the people inside it believe they are alone. What I think about, when I think about that night, is not the moment I heard the creak, or the moment the officers found him, or the moment they walked him past me in handcuffs and he did not look at me. Not once. Just kept his eyes on the floor, with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided not to make eye contact, and is committed to that decision. I think about the 3 to 7 days. I think about what it means that a person can exist inside the architecture of your ordinary life, above your ceiling, breathing your air, calibrated to the schedule of a family who never knew he was there. I think about how many hours of that week I sat on the couch below the room where he lay, and watched television and felt safe, and was not. I think about Cassidy Whitmore in 2019, writing this account on a forum at 1 in the morning, and about Miguel Lua above a ceiling in Modesto, and about the retired woman in Washington State, whose repairman found a man living in the crawl space beneath her floor, a man who had redirected her heating ducts to keep himself warm, a man who was never identified and never found, whose only traces were empty beer cans and the smell of smoke. I think about how many houses and how many quiet suburban streets contain attic hatches that have not been opened in 3 years, and vent screens that were damaged in a storm last spring and have not been replaced, and the specific silence of a ceiling above a bedroom at 2 in the morning, which sounds exactly the same whether there is a person in it or not. The officers told me the house was clear. They told me my parents were on their way home. They told me I had done the right thing by calling, and that I should be proud of myself for staying calm. One of them handed me the candy bowl, which had tipped over on the porch railing in the commotion, and the miniature Snickers were scattered across the porch boards, and I picked them up one by one in the cold, and I did not cry until my mother's headlights came up the street. I want to leave you with one thing, because I think it matters more than the rest of it. The creak I heard that first time was not a mistake on his part. It was not a slip. Investigators told my parents that a person who moves the way this man moved, with that level of patience and that degree of calibration to household's rhythms, does not make accidental sounds. They make sounds when they make them, because they have decided that the person below is settled and occupied, and unlikely to investigate. He made that sound at 7:45 on Halloween night because every light in the front of the house was on, and the television was audible from the street, and children in costumes were walking past every few minutes, and he had assessed correctly that I was fully occupied and not listening upward. He was wrong, that one time, by a fraction, not by much. Just enough. Trust the sound that does not fit. Trust the sound that comes back wrong. Trust your body when it knows something before your mind is caught up. It is almost never nothing, and the times when it is almost never are the times that matter. Not my voice. I need you to understand something before I read you this. The voice you are hearing right now, the one telling you this story, it came from somewhere, from a body, from a throat, and a set of vocal cords, and a larynx shaped by decades of a specific life. It carries information you cannot consciously decode. Warmth, fear, the particular resonance of someone who grew up near the ocean, or in a high desert, or in a house where people shouted. Your voice is a record of everything that ever moved through you. Now imagine that record belongs to someone else. In February of 2024, surgeons at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix performed a 21-hour operation on a man named Marty Cadian. They removed his cancerous larynx. Then they placed inside his throat a donated voice box, taken from a deceased man whose identity, by the conventions of organ donation, was kept private. 4 months after the surgery, Cadian could speak again. His wife Gina could hear him. He could call his 82-year-old mother. He could read bedtime stories to his granddaughter Charlotte, which was all he had wanted. He described it as getting his life back. He did not describe anything else. This is the account of a woman named Patricia Morse, submitted to a private medical ethics forum in Portland, Oregon, in 2022. She asked that the name of the hospital not be used, and that the name of the donor not be published, and that only the details she has authorized be shared. I will honor every one of those requests. Her husband, Thomas, was 47 years old when his larynx was removed. He had spent 2 years watching it go. First the hoarseness, soft and almost musical, the kind that sounds like a man who has been singing somewhere. Then the rasp, then the silence, incremental and final, like a door being drawn slowly shut. He communicated by text and by gesture, and by the specific, exhausted eloquence of a person who has found every possible way to be understood without sound. Patricia learned to read him. She said later that she had come to believe she understood him better in his silence than she had in 20 years of his voice. She said that with regret. The surgery lasted 19 hours. Thomas was in the Mayo Clinic's program, one of fewer than 5 people in the country to receive the procedure at that time. The donor larynx was taken from a person who had died and required lifelong immunosuppression to prevent rejection. A daily pharmaceutical negotiation between Thomas's body and the thing now living inside it. The surgeons used microsurgery to connect nerves. They reconnected the blood supply. They sutured the donor's vocal cords to Thomas's throat and waited to see if his body would accept them. It did. 3 weeks after surgery, Thomas said his first word with the new voice. Patricia was in the room. She described the moment in her account with a careful, deliberate language of someone who has spent a long time deciding exactly how to describe something. She said the word was hello. She said Thomas looked at her with tears on his face. And she said, her voice barely holding as she wrote it, that the sound that came out of her husband's throat was not a sound she recognized. Not wrong, not ugly, just not Thomas. She told herself this was expected. She had been prepared for this by the surgical team, who explained that a transplanted larynx carries the acoustic properties of the donor, the size and shape of the vocal cords, the resonant frequency, the specific timbre, All of it belongs to the person who grew it. Thomas would learn to use the voice. He would make it his own over time, through practice and rehabilitation, in the slow process of a body adapting to a new instrument. She understood this. She held his hand. She smiled. She went home and she sat in the kitchen for a long time, alone. The weeks that followed were, in Patricia's account, both miraculous and deeply strange. Thomas was joyful, in the specific way of a person who has been given back something they feared was gone forever. He spoke constantly, to her, to their daughter, to anyone who would listen. His physical voice, the volume, the energy, the sheer fact of sound returning to their house, filled the rooms the way Thomas himself had filled them before the illness. And yet, the voice was not Thomas. She could not explain it more precisely than that. She tried. She wrote about timbre, about resonance frequency, about the specific warmth that Thomas's voice used to carry that his voice did not. But she also wrote about something else, something she hesitated over for several paragraphs before she set it down. The voice had preferences, not dramatic ones, not in the beginning. Small ones. The new voice was richer in the lower registers, and Thomas found himself gravitating toward it, speaking more slowly, more deliberately, with a depth and weight that had not been part of his speech before. This was, the doctors reassured him, normal. The vocal anatomy was different, and he was learning to use it. The brain adapts. But there was more. 3 months after surgery, Thomas began waking at night. He would sit up at 2 or 3 in the morning, fully alert, and he would speak. Not to Patricia, not to anyone in the room. He would speak quietly, in the low, unhurried register of the new voice, and the words he used were not his own. Patricia lay beside him and she listened, her eyes open in the dark, and she told herself he was dreaming. People talk in their sleep. It means nothing. But it persisted. She began recording the nighttime speech on her phone. Not obsessively. Not at first. But enough to accumulate several weeks of recordings, which she listened to later, in the daytime, with the lights on and the door open, because she had found that she could not bring herself to play them at night. The content of the recordings was not threatening. That was the part she returned to repeatedly in her account. It was not threatening. It was the voice of a person in conversation, or, in memory, addressing someone who was not there, speaking names she did not recognize, describing places she could not identify. And once, on a Tuesday night in October, she heard Thomas's new voice say, in the specific, unhurried cadence that she had come to associate with the donor and not her husband, 3 words she has never fully explained. I am sorry. Said to no one. In a dark room. By a man who was, by every clinical measure, asleep. Patricia brought this to Thomas's medical team. They listened. They were thorough. They explained, carefully and professionally, the documented phenomenon of procedural memory transfer, in which the muscular and neurological habits associated with an organ can, in rare cases, produce patterns of behavior in the recipient that appear to originate with the donor. The phenomenon had been documented primarily in heart transplant cases, where recipients sometimes reported unfamiliar food preferences or emotional responses they could not account for. The voice, the doctors noted, was a particularly complex organ, tied to memory and emotion and the deepest patterns of the nervous system. Some residual transfer of patterning was not, they said, impossible. They used the word residual. Patricia sat with that word for a long time. The first larynx transplant in the United States was performed on a former firefighter from Pennsylvania who had lost his voice in a motorcycle accident when a cable strung between trees caught him across the throat. He eventually gave motivational speeches. He made something of the borrowed voice, whether it ever spoke without his permission, in the dark while he slept. The records do not say. Thomas is, As of Patricia's submission date, well, his cancer remains in remission. His ability to swallow, breathe, and speak has gradually improved. He has made the new voice his own, to the degree that is possible. He laughs with it now. He reads to their grandchildren. He argues with Patricia about the heating the way he always did, but he still wakes sometimes. And the voice still speaks. And Patricia still lies in the dark beside him, listening, trying to determine whether what she is hearing is her husband's voice, or the last transmission of someone who once owned it, still trying to finish something, still trying to say something it never got the chance to say. I am sorry. To whom? For what? The donor's name, Patricia was told, cannot be released. The family has not been contacted. The connection, the medical team explained, should not be pursued. What is inside Thomas belongs to Thomas now. She has accepted that. Mostly. But she told me, at the end of her account, that she thinks about the donor's family sometimes, whether they hear their person in dreams in the specific quality of a remembered laugh, whether the voice they loved is still somewhere, still moving through the world, still finishing its sentences inside a stranger's throat in a dark room in Portland at 3 a.m. She thinks they would want to know it is still speaking. She is not sure she would if the situation were reversed. That is the part that stays with me. Not the voice in the dark. Not the words. But the impossible, unresolvable question at the center of it all. Whose throat is it really? And what does it still need to say? Something I have been sitting with for 6 years, that I have never said out loud to another person, that I am only able to write down now because writing it is the only thing left I have not tried. I am not sure she was wrong. That is not a comfortable thing to say. That is not the kind of thing you are supposed to say about a woman who followed you through the corridors of a cruise ship for 8 days, who stood outside your bathroom door in the middle of the night, who left notes under your cabin door written in the handwriting of someone no longer entirely anchored to the world that the rest of us inhabit. You are supposed to say she was disturbed. You are supposed to say she needed help. You are supposed to remember her as the threat she was and feel grateful that you got away. I feel all of those things. I also feel the other thing, which I cannot name, which lives in the part of my chest that has been quiet since that cruise in a way that nothing was quiet before it. My name is Rachel Voss. My husband then was Owen. We were celebrating our 7th anniversary on the celebrity solstice sailing through the Inside Passage of Alaska, out of Seattle in June of 2018. I will not use the real names of the other couple, because they are real people, and because whatever the woman was going through, she was going through it in tremendous pain, and I have no desire to extend that pain to her family. I will call her Dorothy. I will call her husband Frank. We met them the first evening at dinner. They were perhaps in their mid-60s, neatly dressed in the way that people dress for dinner on cruise ships, careful and put together in a way that reads as effort rather than ease. Frank was quiet. Dorothy was warm in the immediate and slightly overwhelming way that some people are warm, which covers you like heat before you've decided if you want it to be warm. She told us they were also celebrating an anniversary. She did not say how many years. She told us she loved Owen's tie. She told me that I had a face she recognized. I thanked her. It is a common enough thing to say. I did not think about it again until the next morning at breakfast, when she was at the table across the room and I looked up from my eggs and found her already looking at me, with an expression that I am going to try to describe accurately, and that I have tried to describe many times to many people who all made the same slight, careful face in response. She looked at me the way you look at something you had given up on ever seeing again. By the 3rd day, I had begun to understand that something was not right. In the slow, reluctant way you understand things you do not want to understand. She appeared wherever I was. At the pool, in the corridor outside our cabin, in the buffet line in the mornings with a plate she did not seem to eat from, eyes above the food, watching me with that same expression, that particular quality of held breath. She began positioning herself, I noticed, in places where she could see my face. Never behind me, always in front of me, or to the side. Always at an angle that gave her my profile or my full face, never my back. I mentioned it to Owen, who said I was reading into things, which is what Owen said about most of the things I noticed, and which was, in this case, catastrophically wrong. On the fourth day, she appeared beside me at the railing while I was watching the glaciers, and she put her hand over mine on the rail, and she said, in a voice so quiet I had to lean toward her to catch it, that I looked exactly like her daughter. I took my hand back. I said I was sorry for her loss. She said it was not a loss anymore. There is a psychiatric condition I found later, researching what had happened in the months after the cruise, trying to put a frame around it. It is called Capgras syndrome. It is a delusional misidentification disorder in which a person holds the unshakable belief that someone they know has been replaced by an identical double, that the real person is gone, and what stands before them only resembles the original. But there is an inverse to this, a flip side, a shadow version. Some bereaved people develop a different delusion entirely, which is the belief not that a familiar person has become a stranger, but that a stranger has become a familiar person, that the dead have come back, that grief has been answered. Researchers call the extreme version of this prolonged grief disorder, a category of complicated bereavement so severe that the person cannot accept the loss and begins to construct, from available material, a replacement. I did not know any of this on the fourth day of that cruise. I only knew that Dorothy's hand had been very warm over mine, and that she had looked at me as if I had come home after a very long time away, and that this feeling was going to follow me for the rest of the trip regardless of what I did about it. Owen reported it to the ship's security office on the fifth day, after Dorothy left a note under our cabin door. The note was handwritten on the ship's stationery in small, precise letters, and it said things I am not going to reproduce entirely because they were addressed to a dead girl, and I do not have the right to read them out loud on her behalf. What I will say is that the note was not threatening. It was tender. It was the kind of letter you write when you have been given something back that you had stopped believing you would ever have again, and your hands are shaking, and there are too many things to say, and you put them all down in 2 pages, because the ship only gave you 2 pages and you could not waste any of it. Ship security spoke with Frank. Frank, who had the face of a man carrying something very heavy over a very long distance, told them that Dorothy had been this way since their daughter died in a car accident 3 years prior. He said they were managing it. He said he was sorry for any disturbance. He said, and security told us this part, quietly, with the look of people who have been asked to solve a problem they were not trained to solve, that Dorothy believed, entirely, completely, without a single thread of doubt available to be pulled, that I was their daughter, returned to them in some form that he could not explain, but that Dorothy was absolutely certain of. Security moved them to a different deck. They gave us a new corridor key. They told us to report any further contact immediately. That night I saw the spider. It was on the mirror in our cabin bathroom when I went in to wash my face before bed. A large spider, dark-bodied, motionless, positioned at the upper right corner of the mirror at the exact height of my reflection's eye level, not on the wall beside the mirror, on the mirror itself, on the glass, so that when I looked at my own reflection, I could not avoid also looking at it, and it was looking back, and it was not moving. I watched it for what felt like a long time. It watched me with all of its eyes. The arrangement of spider eyes, front-facing, flat, giving nothing away, and it did not move when I reached for the light, and it did not move when I stepped back, and it did not move when I leaned forward to look at it more closely, and then I looked at it more closely, and I stopped. Its legs were too long on one side, 3 legs on the left, pulled tight against the glass, 5 on the right, longer, splayed, in an arrangement that was not the arrangement of a spider's legs, not the symmetry of something biological, the asymmetry of something positioned. I looked at it for a long time, and it looked at me, and I turned the light off and went to bed, and I did not tell Owen about it because I did not have words for it that would not make him look at me the way he was already looking at me about Dorothy. The spider was there the next morning. Same corner, same orientation, same flatness in all of its eyes. I left without washing my face. On the 7th day, I made a mistake. Owen was at the casino. I told him I was going to find a quiet spot to read. I did not find a quiet spot. I found myself on the deck below ours, in a corridor I had not been in before, walking slowly in the way you walk when you are not sure you want to reach your destination. And I knocked on the door of the cabin number Frank had mentioned to security, which security had mentioned in our presence, which I had memorized without deciding to. Dorothy opened the door. She looked at me for a moment without speaking, in the way that people look at things that cannot be real but are nonetheless there. And then her face did something I do not have accurate words for. It was not relief. It was larger than relief. It was what relief might look like if it had been compressed into a very small space for 3 years, and then suddenly, all at once, had room to expand into. She said my name, not Rachel, the other name, the name of her daughter. I want to tell you that I said something useful. I want to tell you that I corrected her, gently, clearly, with the kindness the situation demanded, and that I turned around and went back to my cabin and told Owen and the rest of the cruise was fine. I want to tell you that. What I can tell you is that I stood in that doorway for longer than I should have, and that she kept saying the name, softly, the way you say a name when you have not been allowed to say it for a long time, and that something in the sound of it, the specific quality of being recognized by someone who loves what they are recognizing, did something to me that I am still not able to fully account for. I turned around. I went back to the cabin. I told Owen. He called security. On the 8th night, in the corridor outside the women's bathroom on the Lido deck, Dorothy was waiting for me, and she took my hands in both of hers and said that God had sent me back to them, that she had a room for me at home, that she had kept everything exactly as it was. The security officer who removed her was professional and careful, and Dorothy did not struggle, only kept her eyes on me as they led her away, with that expression. Not fear, not anger, recognition. We spent the last night locked in our cabin. We heard her in the corridor twice. Not knocking, just moving, just the sound of someone standing in a particular spot outside a particular door, in the specific stillness of someone who is waiting for something they believe is coming. Owen held my hand in the dark and we did not speak. I have thought about Dorothy almost every day for 6 years. I have thought about Frank, who was still on that ship, carrying something very heavy. I have thought about their daughter, who was 26 years old when she died in a car accident on a wet road in November, and who had brown hair and brown eyes, and a particular way of standing that her mother had described in the note she slid under our door. I have brown hair, brown eyes, a particular way of standing. I have thought about what it means for a stranger to look at you and see, with the total certainty of someone whose grief has become a form of vision, not who you are, but who you remind them of. And I have thought about grief hallucinations which are documented, which are common, which occur in 30 to 50% of bereaved people. That thing the brain does when it loves someone so much that it continues to generate them after they are gone. And I have thought about whether what Dorothy had was a delusion or a different kind of seeing, one that the rest of us can only manage for a moment in the corner of a dream, and then lose. There was no spider in the bathroom mirror when I got home. I checked the first night, and the corner was empty, and I do not know if I was relieved. I only know that I checked. Trust what people tell you about themselves. Trust what your instincts tell you about danger. Report it. Document it. Get safe. All of that is true, and all of that is the right advice, and I stand behind every bit of it. But grief is a form of knowing, and sometimes, in the deep, dark corridor of it, something recognizes you that you cannot dismiss, no matter how far you walk from the doorway. Be careful what you let see your face. I spent 11 years as a historical preservation contractor, walking through forgotten buildings, crumbling churches, and structures that most people would not set foot inside on a dare. I've documented collapsed mine shafts, cataloged the ruins of burned-down asylums, and worked nights inside structures that local legend had declared untouchable. I have heard the kinds of sounds that old stone makes when it settles in the cold, the groaning and the cracking, the strange percussion of decay. I know those sounds. I know the difference between a building breathing and a building that is doing something else entirely. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in the autumn of 2019. I've never spoken about it publicly until now. I did not want to, but something keeps pulling me back to that night, the way a wound pulls at the edge of a scab. And I think the only way to be free of it is to finally let someone else carry a piece of it. So, here it is. Here is what happened to me inside a fort that has been eating people alive for over 300 years. The assignment came through a heritage documentation firm out of Philadelphia. My job was straightforward enough on paper. Spend 2 nights inside the ruins of a centuries-old colonial fortification on the eastern seaboard, document structural damage to the surviving walls, and photograph any remaining architectural elements before a scheduled restoration project began. The fort, which I will call Harrow Stone Keep for the purposes of this account, had been decommissioned as a public site after a portion of its inner walkway collapsed in 2016, injuring a tourist. Since then, it had been closed to the public. The firm I worked for had obtained a special access permit through the County Historical Commission, and I was the only contractor available who had both the clearance and the equipment for a 2-day solo documentation job. I had done dozens of these. It was a good-paying gig. I agreed without hesitation. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and close, and the trees around the property had already gone skeletal. The fort sat on a low hill about 2 miles from the nearest highway, surrounded by a chest-high stone perimeter wall that had, in several places, simply given up and crumbled into heaps. The main structure was a central keep of dark granite with 5 surviving towers and a long interior corridor that connected them. 2 of the towers had partially collapsed. The other 3 were, according to the firm's preliminary assessment, structurally sound enough to enter with caution. The grounds were overgrown with the kind of tall, pale grass that moves even when there is no wind. And the main gate, a heavy arch of dressed stone, still bore the original iron fittings, 2 enormous hinges in the outline of a bolt lock that had long since rusted away. I parked my truck outside the perimeter, unloaded my gear, and went in through a gap in the western wall. What I want you to understand before I describe that first night is that I had done my research. I always do. I had read the historical record of the fort in its entirety. I knew that it had been built in the early 1700s as a military installation. I knew that it had served at various points in its history as a garrison, a holding facility for prisoners of war, a makeshift hospital during a particularly brutal outbreak of fever in the 1780s, and, in its final years before decommission, a storage depot. I knew that men had died inside its walls. From battle, from disease, from the grinding indifference of institutional confinement, none of that was unusual. Every old structure of this kind carries its dead. That is simply the weight of history, and I had long since made my peace with the idea of working inside places that had witnessed suffering. But there was one specific account in the historical record that stayed with me even after I had set it aside, even after I told myself it was folklore and nothing more. In the winter of 1781, the commanding officer of the garrison, a man named Colonel Edmund Harrow, from whom the fort takes its common name, was betrayed by his own second-in-command. The precise nature of the betrayal is disputed in the historical literature, but the most consistent account states that Colonel Harrow was killed inside his private quarters in the fort's east tower during what was officially recorded as a fever-related death. His second-in-command, a lieutenant named Wells, assumed command immediately after, and held it for less than 3 months before being removed by a military tribunal for reasons that the record describes only as conduct unbecoming and the abuse of command. The accounts of the soldiers who served under both men describe a period of profound unease inside the fort during those 3 months. They wrote of hearing sounds in the East Tower at night, sounds that none of them could explain. One soldier, in a letter preserved in a county archive, described it this way: "I heard a voice crying out from the tower last evening. A voice I recognized and could not account for, and when I put it to my commanding officer, he told me I had dreamed it. But I had not been sleeping. And whatever that voice was calling out, it was not the kind of sound a dreaming man invents." I had read that letter 3 times before I arrived at the fort. I put it out of my mind. I set up my equipment, unpacked my sleeping gear in the safest of the 3 intact towers, the western one farthest from the east, ate a cold dinner, and began my first night's documentation work at around 9 in the evening. It was on that first night, a little after 2 in the morning, that I saw the crow. I've been working my way along the interior corridor, photographing the stonework and taking moisture readings from the surviving wall sections, when I first noticed it. It was perched on a section of collapsed walkway about 30 feet ahead of me, at the junction where the corridor opened into the inner courtyard. The courtyard was open to the sky, and there was enough ambient moonlight coming through the overcast to make the space faintly visible. The crow was sitting on a broken piece of dressed stone about 4 feet off the ground, absolutely still. I am used to birds in old buildings. They roost in the rafters and the gaps in the masonry. They react when you approach. They shift their weight. They cock their heads. They take flight. This crow did none of those things. I walked toward it, keeping my headlamp angled low so as not to blind it, and it did not move, not even slightly. It was positioned with its body directly facing me, and as I drew closer I could see its eyes in the low light, 2 points of flat, dark reflection that tracked my movement with a mechanical precision that had nothing of the twitchy, reactive quality of a normal bird. It watched me the way a camera watches a room, steady, unblinking, without any expression of alarm or curiosity, just a flat and absolute attention. I stopped about 10 feet away. It did not move. I took a step to my left. Its head rotated to follow me with a smoothness that was wrong, too deliberate, like the adjustment of a lens. I took a step to my right. Same thing. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, the 2 of us in the dark courtyard, and it never blinked once. I told myself it was a bird. I moved on. I finished my corridor documentation around 3 a.m. and returned to the western tower to sleep. I dreamed of nothing I could remember. When I woke at 7, the crow was gone from the courtyard, and the morning was gray and windless and absolutely quiet. The second day passed without incident. I documented the north and south towers, cataloged the damage to the east tower's exterior. I had decided against entering it after seeing the condition of the doorframe and reviewed my photographs. Everything was professional, methodical, unremarkable. The only thing I noted in my work log was that my thermal camera, which I used to detect moisture patterns in stone, produced a persistent anomalous reading in the area of the east tower. The reading suggested a significant temperature differential in the interior, cooler by about 12 degrees Fahrenheit than the ambient air temperature outside, which was cold enough on its own for October. Temperature anomalies in old stone structures are not uncommon. Cold air pools in enclosed spaces. I logged it and moved on. It was the second night that broke me. I had gone to bed a little after midnight, exhausted from 2 days of physical work in the cold. I woke at what I later confirmed was 3:17 a.m. to a sound that I cannot fully describe in ordinary language. The closest I can come to it is this. Imagine a human voice, a young voice, mid-range in pitch, caught in a moment of absolute desperation, stripped of language, but not of meaning. It was not a scream exactly. It was more than a scream, more contained than that. more deliberate, as if whatever was producing it was aware of the need to be heard across a very long distance, or a very long time. It came from the direction of the east tower. I lay still in my sleeping bag for what I estimate was about 3 minutes, listening. It came again. Same voice, same quality, same terrible precision. And then a third time, and on the third time, I could almost hear, at the very edge of articulation, the ghost of a word. Not a word I recognized, but shaped like a name, shaped like a plea, shaped like the sound a person makes when they are calling for someone who is not coming. I did not go to the East Tower. I want to be clear about that. I am not ashamed of that decision. I am a professional, not an idiot. I sat in my sleeping bag with my back against the western wall and my headlamp burning on its highest setting, and I listened to that sound cycle through its 3 repetitions twice more, at 3:31 and again at 3:48, and then it stopped entirely, and the fort returned to the kind of silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that has decided to hold its breath. When I finally turned my headlamp off at dawn and allowed myself to sleep again, I had a dream so vivid I am still not certain it was a dream. I was standing in a corridor I did not recognize, though I knew it was inside the fort. The corridor was intact. The stonework clean and well maintained, lit by torches and iron sconces along the walls. There was a boy running. He was young, I would say no more than 17 or 18, dressed in clothes I did not recognize, formal and elaborate, and he was running with the full-body terror of someone who has accepted that they are going to die and is running anyway, out of pure instinct, the body refusing to give up even when the mind already has. He was screaming. He was screaming a single phrase over and over, directed at someone I could not see, and the phrase, whatever language it was in, meant nothing I could consciously translate, but somewhere below the level of translation, somewhere in the part of the brain that understands urgency before it understands words, I knew exactly what he was saying. He was asking someone to help him. He was asking someone who had the power to stop what was about to happen, someone who should have had both the ability and the obligation to protect him, and that person was not coming. That person had chosen to let this happen. The boy ran past me without seeing me, and as he passed, I felt the most profound and unbearable grief I have ever experienced in my life. Not fear, not horror, but grief, the specific grief of a wrong that cannot be undone and has never been properly mourned. I woke up at 9 in the morning with tears on my face and packed my equipment and left. I have since done what any researcher does when something defies their existing framework. I started looking for context. What I found was both comforting and deeply unsettling in equal measure. The experience I had inside that fort is not unique. Across the globe, in the ruins of places where betrayal and violent death intersected, places where the powerful were cut down by those they trusted, where the proper rites of passage were denied, where blood was spilled in secret and grief was given no channel, people report the same basic phenomenon: a sound, a voice, a repetition of threes, the sensation of a presence that is not malevolent exactly, but is utterly unable to rest. There is a fort in Western India, a place called Harrow's Gate in some of the historical literature I came across, that has been documented for over 250 years as producing exactly this kind of phenomenon. Accounts dating back to the late 1700s describe local residents living near the fort's ruins being awakened on certain nights by the sound of a young voice crying out for help, a sound that, according to the documentation, is most pronounced during full moon nights, and most concentrated near the oldest gate of the complex. Paranormal investigators who visited the site in the early 2000s reported recording audio anomalies in the fort's eastern corridors, voices with no identifiable source, a persistent temperature drop in the area surrounding what local historians identified as the chamber where the fort's last young ruler died at the hands of his own family. The accounts are strikingly consistent across centuries and across the barrier of cultural interpretation. A young person, betrayed by a relative, dying in an act of conspiracy, improperly mourned, a sound that will not stop. I am not a person who believes in ghosts in the cinematic sense. I do not believe in malevolent entities with agendas and dramatic entrances. But I have come to believe, after that night in Harrowstone Keep, and after everything I have read since, that there are forms of grief so acute, events so catastrophically unjust, that something of them persists in the physical environment long after the bodies are gone. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something more like a resonance. The way a bell continues to produce sound after you've stopped striking it. The way stone holds cold long after the air around it has warmed. The walls remember. That is the only language I have for it. I returned the following spring to complete the documentation job I had left unfinished. The firm did not ask why I had left early, and I did not explain. I went during the day this time, specifically, and I documented the East Tower's interior with professional efficiency and zero incident. But when I was leaving through the gap in the western perimeter wall, I stopped. The crow was there. The same crow, or one indistinguishable from it, positioned on a section of fallen stone at the edge of the property, facing me with that same blank mechanical attention. Same stillness. Same flat dark eyes following my movement without a single blink. It was about 20 feet away. I stood there looking at it for a long time, and then, because I could not think of anything else to do, I said in a voice that came out quieter than I intended, "I heard you. I know what happened to you. I am sorry no one came." The crow held absolutely still for another 5 or 6 seconds. Then it blinked. Once, slowly, the way something blinks when it has finally been acknowledged, and it flew away without another sound, out over the perimeter wall and into the bare gray trees. And I have not seen it since. I have checked my equipment recordings from that second night a dozen times. The audio from my portable recorder, which I left running on a passive setting near the center of the corridor, captured something at 3:17 a.m., at 3:31, and at 3:48, 3 times, at 14-minute intervals evenly spaced. It is not a clear recording. The quality is poor. The frequencies are in a range that compresses badly, and any recording engineer could tell you there are a dozen mundane explanations for what you are hearing. But if you play it loud, in a quiet room, you can hear it. A voice. Repetitive. Urgent. Absolutely unable to stop. I played it for a colleague once, a man with 30 years of structural engineering experience and no patience whatsoever for what he calls campfire nonsense. He listened to it once, set the headphones down carefully on the desk between us, and did not say anything for a very long time. Then he said, "Play it again." I did. He said, "How old do you think that kid was?" I said I did not know. Young. 17 maybe. 18. He nodded and said nothing else. But he did not leave immediately the way I expected him to. He just sat there in the quiet office for another few minutes, listening to the silence where the recording had ended. And I understood that. I understood it completely, because that is what the sound does to you. It does not make you afraid. It makes you grieve. And grief, unlike fear, does not go away when the lights come on. Trust your instincts. Trust the places that feel wrong. And if you are ever inside a ruin at 3 in the morning, and you hear a voice calling out for someone who never came, do not dismiss it. Do not explain it away. Just listen. Sometimes the dead are not haunting you. Sometimes they are just trying, across 3 centuries of silence, to finally be heard. I'm going to describe what I heard before I describe what I saw. Because the order matters. And because if you understand the sound first, then maybe what comes after will make a certain kind of sense. Not a comfortable sense. Not a sense that lets you sleep. But sense enough that you will believe me when I tell you that what happened in that hut on Whitefall Ridge last February was not a hallucination, was not hypothermia, was not the wind finding cracks in the timber and playing games with 2 frightened people who were already at their limit. It was something else. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 34 years old. I am a licensed wilderness EMT and a certified avalanche rescue specialist, and I have been guiding backcountry trips in the North Cascades for 11 years. I am telling you this because I need you to know that I am not someone who frightens easily, and I am not someone who invents things, and I am not someone who has ever, in 11 years of working in terrain that can kill you in 17 different ways, ever said the words I am about to say. Something was inside that hut. My partner on the trip was Daniel Marsh, 41 years old, also a guide, also certified, also 11-year veteran. We were doing a route assessment on the northwest face of Whitefall Ridge, cataloging snowpack conditions for a commercial trip we had scheduled for March. There is a Forest Service emergency shelter about 6 miles in, a small timber hut used by backcountry travelers since the 1970s. We had used it before. We knew it. We were not afraid of it. We arrived at 3:40 in the afternoon, which was later than we wanted because the skin track had been slower than projected. The sky was doing something we did not like. There is a specific quality to the light in the Cascades when a storm is moving in from the Pacific, a bruised yellowish dimness that experienced people learn to respect, and the sky above Whitefall Ridge that afternoon had that quality so heavily that it almost felt like pressure. We made the call to shelter overnight rather than push for the trailhead in deteriorating conditions. We opened the hut door and the smell hit us before anything else. Not decay exactly. Not rot. Something older and more mineral than rot. The smell of cold stone that has been sealed from the air for a long time. As if the hut had been holding its breath. Daniel stepped in first and turned on his headlamp. And that is when we saw the cat. It was in the far corner, on the floor beside the wood stove. Black, medium-sized, curled into itself the way cats curl when they sleep. Except that it was not sleeping. It was frozen. Entirely solidly frozen, with a thin rime of ice across its fur that caught Daniel's headlamp and threw back the light in a pale ring. Its eyes were open, both of them perfectly open and perfectly clear, as if the freezing had happened so fast that there had been no time for them to cloud. The eyes were amber, almost orange. "How did it get in?" Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying that particular flatness that trained people use when they are processing something unexpected. I looked at the door. It was solid timber, well fitted. I looked at the walls. No gaps. No broken boards. I looked at the window, which was intact. I did not answer him, because I did not have an answer. We left the cat where it was. We got the wood stove going, spread our sleeping pads, ate, and did what you do when you are tired and the storm is arriving outside and the shelter is warm enough, and the only peculiar thing is a dead animal in the corner that you cannot explain. You stop looking at it. You talk about the route, the snowpack, the schedule. You do ordinary things. The storm hit around 9. Wind at sustained speeds that made the hut creak and flex in a way that required active concentration not to find alarming. The snow came horizontally. We were fine. We were warm and sheltered, and we had food and fuel. We were fine. At 11:47, I woke up. Not from a sound. That is the thing I need you to understand. I did not hear anything, not in the conventional sense. What woke me was something I can only describe as a pressure. A weight pressing inward from all sides simultaneously. Not on my skin, but somehow behind it, somewhere between the outside of my body and the inside, as if the air itself had thickened to something just barely below the threshold of solid. My chest felt wrong. Not painful, not constricted, just wrong. In the way that a note played slightly flat is wrong. In the way that something seen from the corner of your eye at an angle that does not make anatomical sense is wrong. I sat up. Daniel was awake, too. He was sitting on a sleeping pad across the hut, his back against the wall, very still, watching the corner where the cat was. He did not look at me when I sat up. He kept watching the corner. Daniel, I said. I hear it, he replied, his voice barely carrying over the wind. I do not hear anything, I told him. That is the point, he said. I want to pause here and tell you something I looked up afterward. Something I wish I had known before that night, because knowing it might have helped me keep hold of what was real and what was not. There is a phenomenon called infrasound, which is sound below the frequency of human hearing, below 20 cycles per second. You cannot hear it, but your body receives it. Infrasound frequencies can induce a state of panic in human beings, can cause pressure in the chest, nausea, what researchers describe as a nervous feeling of revulsion or fear. Scientists have suggested that infrasound may cause feelings of awe or fear in humans, and because it is not consciously perceived, it may make people feel vaguely that odd or supernatural events are taking place. Researchers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that specific mountain shapes combined with particular wind speeds could create vortex effects producing infrasound that would cause the people exposed to it to hear voices, feel vibrations within their chests, and become overwhelmed by panic. This is what they believe now happened to 9 Soviet hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959, who fled their tent in the middle of the night without shoes or coats, and walked into the cold until they died. I did not know any of this at 11:47 on the night of February 9th. What I knew was that the pressure in my chest was building, and that Daniel was staring at the corner, and that the amber eyes of the frozen cat were catching the low glow of the dying wood stove, and that something about the angle of those eyes was wrong. The cat's eyes had moved, not the cat. The cat was still frozen, still curled, still rimmed with ice. The cat had not moved, but its eyes, those open, amber, glassy eyes that had been oriented toward the far wall when we arrived, were now oriented toward Daniel. Both of them, and they were oriented toward Daniel in a way that required the head to have turned. And the head had not turned. I could see with great clarity, in the dim orange light of the dying stove, that the cat's head was in exactly the position it had been in since we arrived, and that its eyes were nonetheless pointed at my partner. "We need to put more wood on," I said, because that was the sentence my brain produced. Not a useful sentence, not an action sentence, the sentence of a person whose higher functions are operating very slowly and carefully, the way they do when the body has already registered something that the mind has not yet decided to accept. Daniel did not respond. He was still watching the corner, and the pressure in my chest was now severe enough that I was breathing in short, controlled intervals, the way you breathe when you are trying not to show that you are afraid. And the sound of the wind outside had taken on a quality I cannot describe except to say that it was not quite wind anymore. It was close to wind. It was wind adjacent. But there was something woven into it. Something that had the shape and cadence of language without any of the content. Something that pressed against the ears from the inside and said nothing and meant everything, and I put wood on the fire. I do not know how long it took me to cross the hut. The distance was perhaps 8 feet. It felt like something I was doing underwater, with the pressure on my skin and the not sound in my ears and Daniel still motionless against the wall. And I kept my eyes on the wood stove, and not on the corner, and not on the cat. And I got the wood from the box, and I opened the stove door and put the wood in, and the fire caught, and the light went up, and the hut got brighter, and the pressure in my chest, gradually the way you let air out of something that has been sealed, reduced. Daniel exhaled. A long, controlled breath, the kind that follows something that has been held. "Did you see that?" he said. "I do not know what I saw," I told him. Neither of us slept again that night. We sat on our sleeping pads with our backs against the same wall, facing the same direction, and we watched the stove, and we did not talk much, and we did not look at the corner, and the storm moved over us, and the wind did its wind things, and the pressure did not return, and at first light we broke camp with a speed that neither of us commented on. I was the last one out. I made myself look at the corner before I shut the door, because I am the kind of person who makes herself do things like that. Who does not want to be someone who ran from a dead animal in a wooden hut and never knew what she ran from? The cat was still there, frozen, curled, eyes open. They were oriented toward the door. I've spoken with Daniel twice since that night. Both times we talked around it rather than directly at it. The way you talk around something that you cannot put inside the existing structure of your understanding of the world. We are both empirical people. We have explanations, infrasound from the wind over the ridge, hypnagogic hallucination from stress and cold, the pareidolia of frightened minds finding faces and intention in static, an amber glass and ice-rimed fur, and the particular shadows of a dying fire. These are good explanations. They are almost certainly correct. The cat's eyes moved. We were both awake. We both saw it. I have a colleague who studies acoustic phenomena in mountain environments. I emailed her the coordinates of Whitefall Ridge and asked her, without explaining why, if the ridge geometry was consistent with the production of infrasound vortices under high wind conditions. Her answer came back in 4 days. She said yes. She said the ridge shape was, in her words, textbook. She said that on a night with the right wind speeds and directions, the area around the emergency shelter would sit in what she called focal point of the vortex. She said that anyone sheltering there under those conditions would likely experience what she described as pronounced physiological stress responses. She said that throughout history, people caught in such acoustic zones have reported sensations of presence, of being washed, of hearing voices in silence. She said these sensations are well documented and entirely explicable. I wrote back and asked her one question. I asked whether infrasound could move the eyes of a frozen animal. She has not responded. I do not go above 4,000 feet anymore. Daniel has taken a position with an avalanche forecasting center that keeps him in an office most of the season. We have not discussed this explicitly. We have not needed to. If you spend enough time in high terrain, real terrain, the kind that does not care about you, the kind that was old before anything walked on it, and will be old long after, nothing walks on it anymore. You will eventually encounter something that sits just outside the edge of what you can explain. Most experienced people will tell you this quietly, away from the kind of company where saying it would cost them something. They will tell you that there are places where the mountain does something to the air, where the air does something to the mind, where the mind reaches for something to put in the space between what it can measure and what it cannot. Most of the time, I believe it is infrasound. The body under pressure, finding ghosts in static. Most of the time. Keep your fires bright in high places. Watch the corners of rooms. And if you wake in the night with a pressure in your chest, and a silence that is not quite silence, and you cannot explain what has woken you, and you find yourself staring at something that should not be capable of looking back, put more wood on the fire, then leave. There is a sound you cannot hear. It is below the threshold of human perception, below 20 hertz, below the basement of the audible world, in a range that bypasses the ear entirely and enters the body through other channels, through bone, through the fluid of the inner ear, through the slow, involuntary resonance of organs that have no idea they are listening. You cannot hear it, but your body can, and your body, when it receives this frequency, does something very specific and very old, something that has nothing to do with logic, or reason, or the accumulated intelligence of a species that has spent 10,000 years building walls between itself and the dark. It panics, not loudly, not in the way of a person who has seen something and can name what they have seen, quietly, diffusely, a creeping wrongness, sourceless and total, a cold that is not entirely temperature, a darkness at the edge of the visual field that vanishes when you turn to look at it, a smell, strange, organic, wrong, that arrives and disappears and arrives again, and no two people in the same car seem to register it at the same moment. This is the account of 3 people on a forest road in the Cascade Range of Washington State, on a night in October in Tiger Territory. I am going to tell you what happened to them, and then I am going to tell you what was actually happening. Their names were Marcus Webb, his sister Dana, and Dana's husband Patrick. They had come for a night wildlife survey, a private excursion, not a commercial safari, arranged through a conservation contact of Patrick's who worked with camera traps in the Western Cascades. The area was part of a rewilded corridor, remote and deliberately understaffed, and the road they drove was a single dirt track through dense second-growth forest, closed to public traffic after sunset. They had been on the road for approximately 2 hours when Dana said, "Do you smell that?" Marcus, in the back seat, said he did not. Patrick, driving, said nothing. 40 minutes later, Patrick said, "There it is again." Dana said, "I am not getting it now." This went on, Marcus would write later, for the remainder of the night. A smell that rotated between them, arriving for one person at a time, rotten and heavy and unlike anything they could clearly identify. Never simultaneous. Never shared. One person smelling something the other two could not, and then the smell gone, and then another person detecting it, and then silence. Marcus said in his account that the smell was the least frightening part. The most frightening part was the darkness. He described it, carefully and with evident embarrassment, as a quality of darkness that appeared to his left at irregular intervals. Not a shadow, not a shape, but a deepening, a saturation of the dark in his peripheral vision that was gone the moment he turned toward it. He turned toward it, he estimated 11 times across the course of the night. 11 times it was not there. 11 times he told himself it was his eyes adjusting to the headlight's edge. He did not tell Dana or Patrick about it. He was, he wrote, afraid of sounding frightened. At around 2 in the morning, Patrick stopped the car. He said, "Listen." They listened. The forest was dense on both sides. The road a narrow corridor of pale dirt between walls of black. The engine was off. They sat in the specific, total silence of a forest at night that is not, actually, silent at all. The white noise of wind through fir and cedar, the distant water of a creek, the occasional creak of a branch adjusting its weight in the cold, and beneath all of it, a sound that Marcus described as a gurgling. Not loud, not directional, not sourced from any particular point in the dark, just a low subsonic presence, felt more than heard, that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the forest itself was producing it. They sat with it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then Patrick started the car and drove. None of them spoke for 15 minutes. They got home at 4 in the morning. They were all ill by the following afternoon. Marcus missed 4 days of work. He described his symptoms as a severe, persistent headache, fatigue that did not respond to sleep, and a quality of unease that he could not attribute to anything specific, that sat in his body like a hell breath, and did not fully release for nearly a week. Dana reported the same. Patrick reported something additional. He said that for 3 nights after the drive, he woke at approximately 3 in the morning with a conviction, total and immediate, that something was outside the bedroom window. He would lie in the dark and feel it. The same diffuse wrongness they had felt on the road, the same cold that was not entirely temperature. He would not go to the window. He never went to the window. He told no one about this until Marcus, comparing notes a week later, described an identical experience in his own home, 40 miles away. They had brought something back with them. Not a creature, not a ghost, a frequency. Here is what the research tells us. A tiger. Specifically, a large adult felid in the genus Panthera, the animal that conservation teams have been tracking along a cascade corridor for the better part of 2 years. Generates infrasound before it moves toward prey, not during the attack. Before it. Scientists speculate that this sound wave, at roughly 18 Hz, can immobilize prey with fear and anxiety, making them easier to catch. It is in the most precise sense a weapon, an acoustic one, deployed not to wound, but to hollow out, to fill the prey animal with a source less, Total terror that has no object and therefore no rational response. That simply occupies the body and removes from it the ability to act. At 19 Hz, infrasound can cause fear, blurred vision, nausea, and dizziness. It can also trick the brain into imagining figures in peripheral vision, as human eyes begin to vibrate almost imperceptibly along with the sound. Peripheral darkness that vanishes when you turn toward it. 11 times. The roar of a tiger contains infrasound of 18 Hz and lower. But the roar is the conclusion. The infrasound begins earlier, much earlier, broadcast through the body of the animal simply by its proximity, its weight, its slow and patient breathing in the dark. The smell that rotated between the three of them, organic, heavy, wrong, is documented in large felt encounters as the specific scent signature of a cat that has been in recent contact with prey, or has been marking territory, or is close enough to the observer that its musk, produced by glands along the jaw and flanks, is detectable in the air. It rotated between them because the wind was shifting. The animal was not in one place. It was moving, parallel to the car, through the dark on both sides of the road. The gurgling sound Patrick heard when he turned off the engine was almost certainly the subsonic component of a vocalization, too low to register as sound, transmitted through the chassis of the car, through the seats, into the bodies of 3 people sitting still in the dark, with the windows open, listening. Psychophysiological sensations caused by infrasound include increased heart rate, vertigo, and nausea. The sense of being touched or pushed may also be associated with infrasound exposure. The headaches that followed, the fatigue, the persistent unease, these are documented effects of prolonged infrasonic exposure. The body's slow recovery from a sustained acoustic assault that it was never designed to recognize or name. Patrick's 3 nights of waking at 3 in the morning, certain something was outside the window, are consistent with what researchers call residual infrasonic sensitization, a period after significant low-frequency exposure during which the nervous system remains in an elevated state of alert, translating ordinary environmental sounds into threat signals. He had been saturated in the tiger's warning frequency for 2 hours. His body was still listening for it. The camera footage from the drive was corrupted, not missing as they initially believed, but degraded. The video file from the relevant 90-minute window opened as noise, as pixelated gray, as static. Patrick's conservation contact, who reviewed the files, said he had seen this before with cameras mounted inside vehicles in areas of significant infrasonic animal activity. The low-frequency vibrations interact with certain recording formats in ways that are not fully understood, and produce precisely this kind of degradation. Not deletion, but dissolution. The signal eaten by the frequency. The footage shows nothing. Because there was nothing to show. The animal, if it was ever on the road, was gone before the headlights reached it. It had been alongside them for an unknown portion of the drive. Close enough to generate the smell, close enough to generate the sound they felt rather than heard. Close enough, Marcus believes, that the darkness he saw at the edge of his vision 11 times was not an artifact of the light. He believes it was the animal, standing just outside the reach of the headlights. Patient, present, generating at 18 Hz, the precise frequency that fills a living body with the conviction that something is wrong. That something is close, that something in the dark intends you harm, while giving that body no object to name, no direction to run, no rational response to apply. Just the frequency, just the feeling, just the thing that is not a ghost, and is far more frightening than a ghost. Because a ghost is only the dead. This is the living, this is something that breathes and waits and knows exactly what it is doing. And it can make you feel it. Completely from the dark, before you ever hear it coming. There is a particular kind of haunting that has nothing to do with the dead. It is the haunting of the living, of the face you saw, and the hand you did not reach in time. and the specific quality of a pair of eyes looking back at you across a room or a street, or the length of a closing door, carrying something you will never be able to name and will never be able to forget. Helen Marsh has been doing this work for 19 years. She operates out of a small office in Portland, Oregon, 2 rooms above a laundromat on a street that smells of detergent and rain. She drives a 10-year-old Subaru, keeps a prepaid phone for contact numbers she cannot afford to have traced, and carries, at any given time, a small Ziploc bag of protein bars, a folded list of shelter addresses, and a collection of handwritten notes from women whose names she will not share with anyone. She has helped remove, by her own conservative count, more than 300 women from situations they could not leave on their own. She does not call it rescuing. She is very firm on this. The word implies she is the one with the power, and the power was always theirs. She says she only ever found the door. The story she told me was about a girl she did not find the door for. Not in time. She wants it told. She asked me specifically to tell it, because she says the worst thing that can happen to a person who did not make it out is that no one speaks about them afterward. She says the silence is a second erasure, quieter than the first, but just as complete. The building was on a narrow street in a neighborhood that Helen had been working in, carefully and quietly, for the better part of a year. A 3-story brick structure, the ground floor occupied by a small grocery with painted-over windows. The upper floor is accessible through a side door that was always locked from the inside. She had been in the building twice before, each time under the cover of delivering supplies through a network of volunteers who had established a fragile, conditional trust with the woman who ran the upper floors. Her name was not given to Helen. She was referred to, by everyone who mentioned her, only as the manager. The manager was not violent in any documented sense. She did not need to be. The structure she maintained was one of debt, and isolation, and the specific, grinding arithmetic of a situation in which the numbers never resolved in the woman's favor, and the manager held every account. The women there owed money they had not chosen to borrow, for transportation and housing and food and the various fees that accumulated from the day of arrival, compound interest on a debt whose original principle no one could clearly state. It was, Helen told me, the oldest system in the world. You do not need chains if you can make someone believe they are the ones who owe. Helen had been making slow, patient progress. She had identified 3 women who had indicated, through the careful, coded language that people in constrained situations develop the way plants develop toward light, that they wanted out. She had a plan, a timeline, a network of contacts prepared. She had done this many times. What she had not planned for was the girl at the window. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, Helen was walking past the building on her way to a meeting with a volunteer coordinator. It was raining, lightly, the kind of thin Portland rain that is less precipitation than atmosphere. She was not looking up. She had learned over years the discipline of not looking up at windows in certain buildings, because looking communicates knowledge, and knowledge can endanger the people inside. But something made her look up. She could not explain it afterward with any satisfaction. She said it was not a sound exactly, not a movement exactly. It was more like a change in the quality of the air on the street, the specific displacement that occurs when someone nearby shifts their attention toward you. The feeling of being watched. She looked up. There was a girl at the second-floor window. Young, Helen estimated later, perhaps 15 or 16, though she held that estimate loosely, because she had learned that age in these situations is frequently obscured by circumstance in both directions. The girl had dark hair, and she was wearing a pale blue sweater, and she was standing very still, with one hand raised against the glass, not waving, not knocking, just placed there, palm flat against the window, the way a person puts a hand against a surface to feel whether it is warm. Their eyes met. Helen stopped walking. The girl did not move. She looked at Helen with an expression that Helen has struggled to describe accurately in the 19 times she has told this story to this point. She said it was not fear. though fear was part of it. She said it was not a plea, though that was part of it also. She said the closest she could come was the word recognition, the look of a person who has been waiting for a very long time and has, in this moment, identified something they were not sure existed, someone who could see them. Helen stood on the sidewalk in the rain, looking up, holding the girl's gaze. And then the manager appeared. She stepped into the frame of the window from somewhere to the left, smoothly and without apparent urgency, the way a person steps into a frame who has done it many times before. She put her hand on the girl's shoulder. The girl's expression did not change. The manager looked down at the street, and her eyes found Helen, and for a moment, the three of them formed a triangle in the rain. The girl at the glass, the manager at her shoulder, and Helen on the sidewalk below. Then the manager drew the girl back from the window. A curtain moved. The window was empty. Helen stood there for another 10 seconds. She counted them. Then she walked around the corner, took out her phone, and called the volunteer coordinator she had been walking to meet. She said quietly into the phone, "There's a girl in that building and we need to move faster." The coordinator said, "How much faster?" Helen said, "Now." What followed was 11 days. 11 days of logistics and communication and the careful, intricate work of repositioning pieces on a board, where one wrong move could make everything disappear. Helen worked through her contacts in the neighborhood. She worked through a legal advocate she trusted. She worked through a former resident of the building who had left 2 years earlier and who agreed, at some personal risk, to make contact with the women inside through channels the manager could not easily monitor. On the 6th day, she received a message that the girl had been seen. She was there. She was being kept closer than the other women. Less access to windows, less contact with anyone outside. On the 8th day, Helen received a message that the girl had a name. Sarah. No last name. Just Sarah. Given to Helen through 3 intermediaries, passed, like a piece of evidence from hand to careful hand. On the 11th day, the plan was ready. On the 12th day, Helen arrived at the building at 6 in the morning with a legal advocate and 2 support workers, all of it documented. All of it coordinated with the one officer in the department she trusted enough to call. The side door was unlocked from the inside by a woman named Carol, one of the 3 who had indicated they wanted out, who had been for 11 days, one of the bravest people Helen had ever worked with. They went upstairs. They brought out Carol. They brought out a woman named Janet, and a woman in her 40s who would not give her name but accepted the shelter address written on a folded piece of paper and pressed it into her coat pocket without looking at it. They looked for Sarah. Helen described this part of the account very carefully and very slowly, and I will relay it as she gave it to me. The room where Sarah had been staying was at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. The door was open. The pale blue sweater was on the bed, folded, not abandoned, folded, the way laundry is folded before it is put away. Sarah was not there. The manager was not there either. The building had a back staircase that Helen had known about in theory and had not fully accounted for in the plan, and the manager had used it, and she had taken Sarah with her, and they were gone before Helen's group reached the 2nd floor. Helen stood in that small, bare room, looking at the folded sweater on the bed for a long time. She does not know where Sarah is. She has looked. She continues to look. She has passed Sarah's description through every network she has access to, and she checks regularly, and she has not found her. The manager dissolved back into the city the way people dissolve when they have done this before and know exactly how to become invisible. Helen told me this story because she wants Sarah to know, if Sarah ever hears it, that someone looked up. That someone stopped on the sidewalk in the rain and held the gaze and did not look away. That someone learned her name and kept it, and has not set it down. She wants Sarah to know that the word recognition went both ways. That Helen saw her, and has not stopped looking. She told me one more thing at the end of the conversation, quietly, in the matter-of-fact tone she uses for the things that have cost her the most. She said, "The worst part is not that I was too late. The worst part is that she put her hand on the glass. She was already standing at the window when I walked by. She had been standing at windows for a long time, waiting for someone to look up, and I almost did not look up. She paused. Then she said, "I always look up now. Everywhere I go, on every street, in every city I work in, I look up at the windows. I look at every face behind glass. I look at every hand raised against a pane, because somewhere on some street, Sarah is still standing at a window, and this time, I will see her." The thing about working in estate forensics is that you are, by the nature of the job, always arriving after the damage is done. You are not the surgeon. You are the person who comes in afterward with a clipboard, cataloging what is missing, calculating what the wreckage is worth. I spent 19 years doing that work, sorting through the financial ruins of collapsed families, dissolved corporations, and contested inheritances. And in that time I developed what I can only describe as a professional immunity to human tragedy, not indifference, immunity. The difference being that indifference means you do not feel it, and immunity means you feel it and continue anyway. I was good at my job precisely because I could sit in a room full of grief and still read the numbers. What I could not do, and what I found out the hard way, was read a room that was not about the numbers at all. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 52 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I moved after resigning my position at the firm I worked at for most of my adult life. I resigned in February of 2022. I told my colleagues it was burnout. That is the closest word I had at the time for what actually happened to me during the 7 weeks I spent in a house in southern Missouri. A house that had been absorbing people and destroying dynasties since the 1860s. A house that, when I finally walked out of it on a Wednesday morning with my laptop case and my overnight bag, and the specific hollow feeling of a person who has been fundamentally rearranged from the inside, I drove directly to a rest stop on Interstate 55 and sat in my car for 45 minutes before I trusted myself to drive again. I am going to tell you what happened in that house. All of it. I kept detailed notes throughout. I always do. It is how I process, and those notes are sitting in a folder on my desk as I write this. Some of what I am going to tell you is in those notes. Some of it is not. Some of it I could not write down at the time because writing it down would have meant committing it to record as a real event, and I was not ready to do that. I will tell you the whole truth now. In the autumn of 2021, my firm was retained by the probate division of a St. Louis law office to conduct a financial audit of the estate of a family I will call the Hargrove family, a prominent Missouri dynasty whose manufacturing and real estate interests had produced enormous wealth over 4 generations, and whose collapse beginning roughly in 2015 had been as swift and total as it was, from the outside, inexplicable. The patriarch of the family, a man named Robert Hargrove, had built the family's 3rd-generation fortune into something truly substantial through the 1980s and 90s. His son, Thomas Hargrove, had inherited the whole of it in 2009, and by 2019, virtually all of it was gone. Thomas himself was dead, having suffered a sudden and catastrophic health event at the age of 44, with no prior diagnosis of any serious condition. His wife, Angela Hargrove, had filed for bankruptcy the previous year. Their daughter, the only surviving heir, was living with relatives in Kansas City and wanted nothing to do with the estate or its contents. The firm I worked for had been engaged to complete a full financial inventory of the family's primary residence, a large Victorian property in South St. Louis, before the probate court could settle the outstanding debts. The property was called Hargrove Hall. It had been in the family since the 1880s, when the first Hargrove to make serious money in St. Louis purchased it and expanded it into the 31-room structure that still stood at the time of my engagement. It was a well-known property in the neighborhood, well known enough that when I mentioned the address to my contact at the law office, she paused before responding. I asked if she was familiar with it. She said she was. She did not say anything further. I noted the pause and moved on. I arrived at the property on a Monday morning in late November, equipped with my standard audit kit, a portable scanner, and a suitcase for what I expected to be a 4-day job. The law office had arranged for the utilities to remain active through the end of December. The property had been uninhabited for approximately 18 months since Thomas Hargrove's death. The locks had been changed and I had been provided with the key. I let myself in through the front entrance, which was a heavy carved wood door set into a stone frame that had aged to the particular gray-brown of old bone. Inside, the house was exactly what I expected a wealthy Victorian property to look like after a year and a half of abandonment. The particular kind of disarray that comes not from violence but from the simple cessation of care. Furniture covered with dust sheets, a layer of fine gray dust on every horizontal surface, the smell of old wood and stagnant air, and something faintly sweet beneath it that I could not identify on the first day. The lights worked. The heating was sluggish but functional. I set up my workspace at the dining room table, noted the inventory of visible items in each room, and began the systematic process of cross-referencing the estate's listed assets against what was physically present. On the second day, I found the room. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for it. The floor plan provided by the law office listed 31 rooms, and I was working through them methodically from the ground floor upward. The room I found was on the second floor, at the end of the east corridor, behind a door that was not on the floor plan. Not omitted by error, simply not there. A door in the wall of the east corridor that the floor plan did not acknowledge. It was a plain door, no different from the others, with a standard brass handle. I noted it in my log as unlisted room, east corridor, floor 2, and opened it. It was smaller than the other rooms, perhaps 12 feet square, and it was the only room in the house that did not smell of abandonment. It smelled, with a specificity that was disorienting after a day and a half of dust and stagnant air, of something recent. Not food, not cleaning product, something more organic and harder to name, the way certain old books smell. Warm paper and age, and the trace of a person who is not there anymore. The room was almost empty, a wooden chair against the far wall. A framed photograph on the floor, leaning against the baseboard, face turned inward, and on the wall above the chair, drawn in what appeared to be pencil or charcoal, a series of marks, vertical lines, grouped in 4s with a diagonal cross stroke, the kind of tally counting a person might make to track days. I counted the marks. There were 212. I turned the photograph over. It was a formal portrait, the kind that wealthy families have taken on significant occasions, showing 4 generations of the Hargrove family gathered in the front parlor of the house I was standing in. The patriarch, the son, the grandson Thomas, and in Thomas's arms, a small girl of perhaps 4 or 5, who I recognized from the case file as his daughter, now living in Kansas City. They were all smiling. On the back of the photograph, in a cramped, deteriorating hand that was clearly written over a long period, were names and dates. I will not reproduce all of them. What I will tell you is that the pattern of those dates was what broke through my professional immunity for the first time in 19 years. 4 generations of the Hargrove family, listed chronologically, and beside each name, 2 dates. The date they first took up residence in this house, and the date they died. With one exception, Thomas Hargrove. Beside his name, a date of arrival, and then only a question mark where the date of death should have been, written in a different ink, as if added later by a different hand, that was shakier and less certain than the rest. I put the photograph down. I went back to my workstation. I worked until 11 that night, logged my progress, and went to bed in the guest room I had designated for myself on the second floor. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and told myself with the conviction I had spent 19 years honing, that what I had found was a room used by a troubled person in a troubled family, and that the numbers on the wall were the numbers of someone counting something that had nothing to do with me, and at the photograph was the record-keeping of a family with a complicated and genuinely tragic history, and that none of it was anomalous in any way that my framework could not account for. I slept. And then, at some point in the early morning, I woke up. What woke me was not a sound. It was a presence. And I am aware of how that word lands, and I am using it anyway because it is the only accurate description of what I felt. Not heard, not saw, felt in the room. The specific, unmistakable physical sensation of not being alone in a space you were alone in when you closed your eyes. I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, but there was something in the air that I have since spent a great deal of time trying to describe accurately. And the best I can manage is this. The temperature in the room had changed, not the ambient temperature. My breath was not fogging. The cold was not that kind. The temperature of the attention in the room had changed. Something in that space was oriented toward me in a way it had not been when I fell asleep. Directed and deliberate and completely without either warmth or hostility. The way a camera is oriented toward a subject. The way a building looks at you when the building has been looking at people for a very long time and has learned, through repetition, exactly what to look for. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. I have since spoken with a woman who studies what she calls site-specific trauma accumulation, the measurable psychological and physiological effects of prolonged exposure to environments where extreme distress has occurred. She told me that there is documented evidence suggesting that certain locations produce consistent physiological effects in occupants, elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep architecture, heightened amygdala response, that correlate directly with the severity and duration of the traumatic events associated with that space. Not ghosts, she was careful to say, not haunting in any supernatural sense, simply the measurable resonance of a space that has absorbed over time more suffering than the average human nervous system is equipped to share without effect. She said the science is preliminary and contested and deeply unpopular in mainstream academic circles. She said it anyway. I want to tell you about a real family, because what happened to the Hargroves is not unique. You may know the name Lemp, Insane Lemp, Louis, Missouri, the same city where the Hargrove house stood. The Lemp family built one of America's most powerful brewing dynasties in the mid-1800s. Their patriarch, William Lemp Sr., shot himself in the head inside the family mansion in 1904, never having recovered from the sudden death of his favorite son, Frederick, 3 years earlier. It was the first of 4 suicides. His son William Jr. shot himself in the same building 18 years later. His sister Elsa did the same in her home that year, and in 1949 his brother Charles, who had grown so paranoid in his declining years that he rarely left the house, who had watched the family around him unravel one by one, shot his dog first, then himself, in a room adjoining the one where his brother had died. 5 family members dead by suicide, 4 of them inside the same house. The question that researchers and historians and anyone who has ever spent a night in the Lemp mansion still cannot definitively answer: was the mansion itself the source of what happened to them? The last surviving son of the Lemp family, a man named Edwin, who had been smart enough to leave the house and never return, died at the age of 90, of natural causes. His final instruction to his caretaker was to destroy his entire art collection and all family heirlooms. Not sell them, not donate them. Destroy them. The only person in his bloodline to die in his own bed, at his own time, in a house he had chosen for himself. The only person who had refused to be owned by the thing that owned the others. I thought about that a great deal in the east corridor of Hargrove Hall. What I found over the following 5 weeks, because what I expected to be a 4-day audit became something I could not walk away from, not because the work required it, but because something in me had been caught, the way a thread is caught on a nail, and pulling away would only have made the damage worse, was a pattern so precise and so consistent that I have never been able to dismiss it, no matter how many rational frameworks I have applied to it since. Every adult male in the Hargrove family who took up primary residence in that house died before the age of 55. Everyone. Across 4 generations. Heart events, sudden illness, one accident on a staircase that the coroner ruled consistent with a fall. No violence, no crime, no single diagnosis that connected them. Just the pattern, generation after generation of men arriving in that house at the height of their power and capability and declining, inside those walls, into something diminished and finally absent, while the house itself persisted. I found in the estate's financial records evidence that Thomas Hargrove had known, not known in the sense of believing in a curse. Thomas was a practical, analytical man, as the depositions in the bankruptcy file made clear. Known in the sense that he had done the research. There were printouts and a locked file drawer in the study. Articles, genealogical records, a handwritten timeline that he had constructed himself, mapping the dates. He had worked it out exactly the way I worked it out, from the other side of the ledger. He had seen the pattern, and the pencil marks on the wall of the unlisted room, I believe, were his. 212 days from the date of the last entry in the timeline to the date of his death. He had been counting, he had known it was coming, and he had sat in that small room and counted the days, and the house had taken him anyway. I completed the audit. I submitted my report. I did not include any of what I have just told you in that report, because there is no line on a probate inventory form for what I found in the East Corridor, and in the unlisted room, and in the specific quality of the attention that filled that house at 3:17 in the morning. I told the law office that the property's assessed value was significantly impaired by its condition and its history, and that I recommended against any attempt to sell it as a private residence. I recommended it be transferred to a historical preservation trust or demolished. I left on a Wednesday morning in January of 2022. I took nothing from the house except my equipment and my notes. I drove to the rest stop on Interstate 55 and sat for 45 minutes watching the trucks pass on the highway, listening to the specific silence that exists on the far side of something you cannot explain or unexperience. Then I drove to Raleigh, which is as far as I reasonably could get from South St. Louis without leaving the country. I resigned from the firm 3 weeks later. My colleagues attributed it to burnout, as I said. They were not wrong exactly. They were just describing the symptom rather than the cause. There is one more thing. The daughter of Thomas Hargrove, the small girl in the photograph, now somewhere in her early teens, living in Kansas City with relatives who are not Hargroves, and who do not own the house, and who have, I sincerely hope, no intention of ever returning to it. I have thought about her more than I have thought about anything else from those 7 weeks. About whether she knows, about whether the pattern requires proximity, whether it is the building that carries the weight or the bloodline, about whether the distance between Kansas City and South St. Louis is enough. I do not know the answer to any of those questions. What I know is that the Hargrove house is still standing. I know that the probate court eventually approved its transfer to a development group based in Chicago. I know that the development group's most recent filing, from 6 months ago, listed the property as undergoing environmental review, with no projected completion date. I know that the principal of that development group, a man who had been developing St. Louis real estate for 30 years with an excellent track record and no prior history of financial difficulty, filed for personal bankruptcy 8 months after the transfer was completed. I do not believe in haunted houses. That sentence used to be a statement of conviction. Now it is a sentence I say carefully and slowly, the way you say a thing that is still technically true, but whose truth has become, over time, much narrower than it once was. What I believe in, with the specific and unshakable certainty of a person who has sat in a building at 3:17 in the morning and felt it looking back, is this: there are structures in the world that have absorbed so much from the people who lived and suffered and conspired and died inside them that they no longer function simply as buildings. They function as something else, as repositories, as anchors, as engines of a process that operates on a timescale that makes individual human lives look like single entries in a very long ledger. They do not hate you. They do not want anything from you in the way that people want things. They simply continue, across the generations, doing what they have always done, which is collect. Every dynasty has a house, and some houses outlast every dynasty that tries to own them. Check the records before you sign anything. Count the names, count the dates, and if the pattern is already there, already written in someone else's hand on a wall behind a door that is not on the floor plan, do not convince yourself it is someone else's story. It was always a ledger. It just took me 19 years of counting other people's losses to understand that eventually, everything gets audited. The house that knows her name. David couldn't remember his mother's maiden name. He'd been asked to fill out a security question, and the answer simply wasn't there, as if it had never existed. The house on Blackwood Drive had been a steal. 3 bedrooms, updated kitchen, hardwood floors, a garden that bloomed year-round despite the New England winters, and furnished, completely furnished. The previous owners left everything, the realtor, a man named Caleb, had explained. They moved suddenly, international relocation. Couldn't take it with them. Evelyn had run her hand along the leather sofa. This is beautiful. These are expensive pieces. They were particular about quality, Caleb had said. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. You'll find the closets are stocked too. Clothes, shoes, all high-end brands. All in, well, they'll fit you both. Probably. David had laughed. That's oddly convenient. Caleb hadn't smiled. Yes, convenient. They'd moved in on a Saturday in late April. The house welcomed them. That's how Evelyn had described it. Warm, comfortable, as if it had been waiting. The furniture fit their style perfectly. The art on the walls matched their taste. Even the books on the shelves were ones they'd talked about reading. It's like someone designed this place for us, Evelyn said that first night. David had agreed. But he'd noticed something strange. None of the items had personal marks. No inscriptions in the books. No photos in the frames. No labels on the clothes. Just quality. Expensive. Anonymous. As if whoever lived here before had been erased. The first change happened 3 days after they moved in. David woke up craving coffee with cinnamon. He'd never liked cinnamon in his coffee before. Had always taken it black. But that morning, the craving was overwhelming. He went to the kitchen and found the cinnamon already sitting beside the coffee maker, as if the house had known. Evelyn noticed it too. She'd started wearing clothes from the previous owner's closet. They fit perfectly, better than her own clothes. And slowly, without realizing it, she stopped wearing her own things entirely. The house's wardrobe felt right. More her style. More her she was supposed to be. Except, she couldn't remember when her style had changed. By the second week, David's routines had shifted. He woke at 6:30 instead of 7. Made breakfast a specific way. Scrambled eggs with chives, even though he'd always preferred omelets. He took his coffee to the back porch, sat in the wicker chair, looked at the garden, and felt peaceful, as if he'd been doing this for years. But he'd only been in the house for 14 days. Evelyn started calling him Danny. She didn't realize she was doing it at first. Danny, did you remember to lock the garage? Danny, I'm going to the store, need anything? It took David 3 days to notice. Why are you calling me Danny? My name is David. Evelyn had blinked, confused. I don't know. It just feels right, doesn't it feel right? And the terrible thing was, it did. Danny felt more natural than David, as if David was the nickname the temporary name, and Danny was who he'd always been. The photographs started appearing in the 4th week. They'd been in frames throughout the house. Empty frames, waiting. But one morning, David noticed a photo in the hallway. A couple, standing in front of the house, smiling. The man looked familiar, like David, but not quite. Taller, maybe. Different hair. The woman looked like Evelyn, but older, different eyes. "When did we take this?" David asked. Evelyn studied the photo. I don't remember. But that's us, isn't it?" David wasn't sure. The faces were close. The bodies were similar. The clothes were the ones hanging in their closets. But something was wrong. "Look at the date stamp," Evelyn said. "Bottom right corner. The photo was dated 3 years ago. They'd only been in the house for a month." David tried to call his sister. He picked up his phone, scrolled through contacts, and realized he couldn't remember her name. Couldn't remember if he even had a sister. The memory was there, faint, distant. But when he tried to focus on it, it slipped away, like trying to hold water in his hands. That night, David went through his wallet. Driver's license, credit cards, insurance card. His name was there. David Morrison. But when he looked at the license, really looked at it, the photo seemed wrong. The face was his, but also not quite his. As if he was looking at someone wearing his face, someone who'd been David Morrison longer than he had. Evelyn started talking about memories David didn't have. "Remember when we went to Portland? That little restaurant by the waterfront?" David didn't remember. "Of course you do. We had the salmon. You complained about the wine." I don't drink wine." Evelyn's face had clouded. "Yes, you do. You always order the house red." And David, despite knowing he'd never liked wine, felt the memory forming. The restaurant. The salmon. The wine that had been too sweet. A memory that wasn't his, but was becoming his, filling the spaces where his real memories used to be. David found a box in the basement, hidden behind old paint cans, covered in dust. Inside were personal effects, driver's licenses, passports, wedding rings, photographs, all belonging to different people, different couples, different names, but all the faces looked similar, like variations on a theme. Like the house was trying to find the right combination, the right fit, the right identity to wear. David brought the box upstairs, showed Evelyn. "These are from previous owners. Look at the dates. These people lived here years apart, decades apart, but they all left. Everything." Evelyn looked at the photographs. Her expression was distant, unfocused. "They look happy," she said. "Don't you think they look happy?" "Evelyn, they're gone. They left without taking anything. Without taking their identification, their wedding rings. Maybe they didn't need those things anymore. Maybe the house gave them something better." David grabbed her shoulders. "The house is changing us, can't you feel it? We're becoming someone else, we're losing ourselves." Evelyn smiled. It was a strange smile. Peaceful. Content. "Is that so bad? We're happy here. Aren't we happy?" And David realized he was, despite everything. Despite the stolen memories. Despite the shifting identity. He was happy. Happier than he'd ever been. And that terrified him more than anything else. David tried to leave. He packed a bag, got in his car, started the engine. But as he backed out of the driveway, he felt it, a pulling, a tightness in his chest. A voice that wasn't a voice, Stay. You belong here. This is home. This is where you've always been. David's hand shook on the steering wheel. He could push through, could keep driving, could escape. But the further he got from the house, the weaker he felt, as if his identity was tied to the property, as if leaving meant dissolving. He turned the car around, drove back, and felt the relief flood through him as he pulled into the garage. The house settled, satisfied. David was home. By the 8th week, David and Evelyn had stopped questioning. They were Danny and Vera now. Those were the names that felt right. The names the house called them. Their old lives, their old friends, their old families. Those had faded, become distant, unimportant. Everything they needed was here, in the house, in each other, in the perfect routine the house had built for them. They woke at 6:30, made breakfast together, sat on the back porch with their coffee. Danny worked in the study. Vera tended the garden. They had dinner at 7, watched the news, went to bed at 10. The same routine, every day, forever. And they were happy, genuinely, completely, terrifyingly happy. 3 months after moving in, Vera found a wedding album. It showed a couple getting married, in the garden, behind the house. The man was Danny, the woman was Vera, except it wasn't their wedding. They'd been married in a church, in the city, 5 years ago. But when Vera looked at the photos, when she saw the couple smiling in the garden, she remembered it differently. The garden wedding, the sunset ceremony, the vows spoken under the oak tree. That was real. That had happened. The church wedding, that was someone else, someone who wasn't her. The realtor, Caleb, returned to the property one evening. He stood at the end of the driveway, watching the house. He'd been watching for months, ever since Danny and Vera moved in. He'd seen it happen before, many times, too many times. The house consumed identities, absorbed memories, reshaped residents into whatever it needed them to be. And Caleb had been the first, decades ago, before he understood, before he learned. The house had tried to take him, tried to make him forget, tried to reshape him. But Caleb had resisted, had held on to a piece of himself, had become something else, not a resident, not consumed, a watcher, a guardian, someone who retained enough free will to warn the next people, but never enough to stop them. Caleb watched as Danny and Vera moved through the lit windows. Perfect routine, perfect happiness, perfect erasure. Another couple absorbed. Another set of identities added to the house's collection. In a year, maybe 2, they would leave, or disappear, or simply stop existing outside the house, and new people would move in. The cycle would continue. Unless someone said no, unless someone refused the house's offer, rejected the comfort, fought the changes. Caleb had tried to warn them, in his way, with his flat voice and his strange comments. But they never listened. They never said no. Caleb turned to leave. But then a car pulled up. A young couple, looking at the property, admiring the garden. "Is this the one?" the woman asked. "Yeah. 3 bedrooms, fully furnished. Price seems too good to be true." Caleb stepped forward. "Can I help you?" The couple smiled. "We're just looking, thinking about making an offer. Do you live here?" "I used to," Caleb said carefully. "Long time ago. Beautiful house. Very accommodating." "Is it for sale?" the man asked. Caleb looked at the house. at the warm lights in the windows, at Danny and Vera moving inside, happy, content, no longer themselves. "It's always for sale," Caleb said quietly. "The house always needs new residents, new identities, new memories to collect." The couple laughed. Thought he was joking. "Well, if it goes on the market, we'll definitely be interested." Caleb nodded. "When it does, when you get the call, remember this: you can say no. You can refuse. You don't have to take the offer." "Why wouldn't we?" the woman asked. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her, trying to convey the warning his voice couldn't fully express. "Because once you move in, you stop being who you are, and you become who the house needs you to be. And you'll be happy. Genuinely happy. But you won't be you anymore." The couple smiled politely, uncomfortable. "Right. Well, thanks for the info." They walked away, got in their car, drove off. Caleb stood alone in the darkness, watching the house, knowing they'd be back, knowing they'd make the offer, knowing they'd move in. Because the house always got what it wanted. And Caleb could only watch, could only offer the choice, could only hope. Someday, someone would say no. Inside the house, Danny and Vera had dinner. They talked about their day, their plans, their happiness. They didn't remember being David and Evelyn, didn't remember the lives they'd left behind, didn't remember the people they used to be. The house had settled, content. Its residents were happy, complete, absorbed. And somewhere in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very foundation, the house remembered everything they'd forgotten. Every name, every memory, every identity. Collected, preserved, consumed, forever. Identity is not fixed. It's written in memory, in habit, in the small choices we make every day. And when something rewrites those choices, when something reshapes those habits, when something consumes those memories, we become someone else, happily, willingly, completely. And the worst part is, we never notice we're gone.